Today we're discussing 4 cold cases that were solved recently with new DNA evidence. Let's get into it. Number 1. Stacy and Jacob Falcom Dewey. In the early morning hours of October 28, 1994, a Seattle Times newspaper delivery person started their route in Renton, King County, Washington. It was around 3:30 a.m. when they saw something that didn't look right. Down a small dead-end road lined with trees, they saw a vehicle with its doors open, and next to the vehicle there was something on the road. They stopped and discovered the bodies of a young woman and a young child and called 911. Officers arrived and were able to identify the woman as 23-year-old Stacy Falcom Dewey, and they later identified the child as her 3-year-old son, Jacob Dewey. Both had multiple gunshot wounds, which was the cause of their death. Initially, it was thought to have been a robbery gone wrong. The contents of Stacy's purse had been strewn both inside and outside of her '84 Buick Century, but further evidence suggested that there may have been a darker motive behind the crime. Packing tape that appeared to have been used to bind Stacy was bound on the passenger side of the vehicle. Stacy's belt was undone and several buttons from her shirt were found in the vehicle. The medical examiner also suggested that Jacob may have been killed facing Stacy, or she might have been holding him when he was killed. The 2 fatal shots that had killed Jacob had gone through his body and hit Stacy in the arm and shoulder. Then she was killed with 2 shots to the back of the head. Stacy had been covered in bruises, including around her neck and a significant head wound from what was assumed to have been a blow from the back of the gun. Stacy's clothing had also been caked with mud, whereas Jacob had been completely clean, indicating that she might have tried to run away before being wrestled back into the car. The bodies were moved into the middle of the road, and it was presumed the killer had intended to drive off in the car, but the keys had fallen between the driver's door and the seat, and had only been found when the seats had been fully removed. Officers suspected that when the killer couldn't find the keys, he then fled on foot away from the crime scene. Neighbors who lived in the area reported hearing gunshots at around 2:10 a.m., giving law enforcement an estimated time of the death of the 2 victims. Earlier that evening, Stacy had dropped Jacob off with a babysitter, a friend who lived in an apartment complex that Stacy had recently moved out of. Stacy and Jacob had recently moved into an apartment 4 miles away, and she lived with her boyfriend. Jacob was with a babysitter because Stacy was going out to celebrate her birthday with friends and family, and had returned to pick up her son around 1:45 a.m. Witnesses said they saw her get into her vehicle and drive off, and it should have been a short journey home, only a few minutes drive away. Her boyfriend was reported to have been at home at the time of the murders, and he had expected them to return, but he didn't notice they hadn't until officers knocked on the door because he'd fallen asleep. Officers extensively investigated the brutal murders for several years. Several suspects had been ruled out, which had included Stacy's boyfriend and ex-husband, but eventually the case went cold. In 2001, several advances in DNA technology had been made, and it was this case that was reopened to look at for new leads. That year, several samples that had been collected from the autopsy were tested for DNA, and they found male DNA under her fingernails. In 2002, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab got a match from the incarcerated inmate Jerome Frank Jones, who was in federal prison in California for a murder he committed in 1995. They flew to California to interview him, who, when shown photos of Stacy, denied having known her. In 2002, they also interviewed the building manager of Stacy's old apartment, the one that her friend had lived in, and he confirmed that a man named Jerome Jones lived there in 1994. No other connection between Stacy and Jones was found, and in 2002, due to what was described as delays, budget cuts, and other procedural hiccups, the case fell between the cracks for nearly a decade. A podcast highlighted the case in 2019, and it was only because of that coverage that the family had been alerted of the DNA connection when they hadn't known about it before. They then pushed law enforcement to answer why that evidence hadn't produced an arrest. In 2021, the case was officially reopened. Several more advances in DNA had occurred since 2002, and investigators wanted to see if there was anything else from that crime scene that could be new for the case. In December 2021, additional DNA evidence was found, this time on the sleeve of Jacob's coat. This DNA connected Jerome Jones directly to the crime scene. On February 18, 2022, the now 51-year-old Jerome Jones was charged in the 1994 murder of Stacey Falcon Dewey, as well as the murder of Jacob Dewey. He has also been charged with robbery and sexual assault. Jones had been scheduled for release in 2030 from his previous convictions, but if convicted of these charges, he will likely be sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Jerome Jones, currently sentenced to 56 years in a California prison for a different murder. But investigators with Renton Police say he is the key to solving this double murder mystery. So thanks for joining us for your news at 10. I'm David Rose.
And I'm Jamie Tompkins. Here's the really amazing part of that story. It all began with this letter. We're going to give you a closer look right now.
It is a handwritten note delivered to us here at Fox 13 News, written by Vianne Falcon, Stacey's mother and Jacob's grandmother, asking us to look into this case. This after 2 decades of searching for justice.
And that note says it all. She never gave up hope, fighting for charges to be brought against Jones for more than 2 years now.
And Fox 13's Jennifer Lee is live in Kent tonight at the courthouse he will be making his first court appearance at. And Jen, this is really another amazing example of the power of DNA evidence and detectives who refuse to give up.
Yeah, very true. That suspect, Jerome Jones, will be making his first appearance here now in less than 2 weeks, and that's for 2 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. The family has been waiting for these charges since 1994, and with that DNA evidence coming to light about 20 years ago, they question why this didn't happen sooner.
I've been at my breaking point for a very long time.
Vianne Falcon says her daughter Stacey was a great mother and her grandson Jacob was a spontaneous boy. All of these years, she's kept them close in her heart since their brutal murder in Renton back in 1994. It wasn't until 2016 that she requested a copy of the medical examiner's report.
Had I known about the DNA match in 2002, I'd have never sent for that report. I'd have never read any of it. So I blame them for me having this my smile is gone.
According to court documents, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab detected DNA evidence on Stacey through an oral swab and fingernail clippings that matched a man named Jerome Jones. Falcon says she didn't know DNA evidence existed until many years later in 2019 through a local Seattle Times journalist.
We were flabbergasted. I just couldn't believe it that they had all that time to get a hold of any one of us and let us know, and they hadn't contacted anybody.
The 51-year-old suspect is currently behind bars in a California state prison for shooting a man to death in March of 1995, which is just months after allegedly killing Stacey and Jacob in Washington state. Court documents say a number of additional evidence items were submitted and resubmitted over the years, given advances in DNA identification.
Because it's pretty embarrassing for them to have sat on this DNA for 18 years and not done anything.
In December 2021, investigators learned DNA evidence was also found on the jacket of Falcon's 3-year-old grandson.
I'm so embarrassed when I go up to the graveside. I told her I'd have some good news for her. Well, that was like 15, 20 years ago. And now I do have good news for her.
Jones will be extradited from California and face a judge here in Washington state. His first appearance is scheduled for February 28th. For now, reporting live in Kent, Jennifer Lee, Fox 13 News.
Number 2. Patricia Barnes. 26 years after Patricia Barnes, a 61-year-old Seattle, Washington resident's body was discovered in Olalla, Washington, her case has been solved thanks to the advanced DNA testing. In 1995, Patricia Barnes was last seen by acquaintances 3 days before her body was discovered in a ditch. She was found nude in a sleeping bag with several gunshot wounds to her head. Her social circle was very small, which made the case more difficult to solve. During the investigation, the Kitsap County detectives collected and documented over 130 pieces of evidence. The evidence included the sleeping bag, evidence from her body, and cigarette butts found at the crime scene. However, after a large amount of follow-up, they could not identify a suspect. For some time, it was suspected that Patricia was the victim of Robert Lee Yates, also known as a Spokane serial murderer, even though her profile did not match those of Yates's previous victims. Detectives later proved that Yates was stationed in Alabama at the time of Patricia's murder, eliminating him as a suspect. In 2018, the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office reopened Patricia's case. According to an interview with Detective Mike Grant, he and another detective decided to submit evidence they felt would be significant to finding the murderer to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The crime lab developed an unknown male profile using the evidence submitted, which would be the first solid break in the case in decades. However, there was no match after entering the DNA profile into CODIS. Yet another roadblock in the case, but the detectives were determined to find justice for Patricia Barnes. With the help of the Attorney General's office, the detectives were given several private labs to submit the evidence to for processing. One of those labs was Ortham Labs out of the Woodlands, Texas. Scientists were able to build a male genetic profile. According to Detective Grant, Ortham Labs had identified a first or second cousin, which led them to a name, Douglas Keith Crone. Detectives tracked Crone to Nogales, Arizona in 2016 and learned that Crone had died at his home during an electrical accident. The Pima County Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy and sent blood samples to detective in Kitsap County. They then in turn sent them to the state crime lab for DNA testing. 2 weeks later, they confirmed that Douglas Crone's DNA matched evidence collected from the crime scene, using a cigarette butt left at the scene, and it was concluded that Crone had been the killer.
Realistically, this case was solved in 1995, and it was just a matter of waiting for forensic science and the advent of genetic genealogy to evolve, and it was just a case waiting to be solved. How they came to meet, nobody knows. Douglas isn't mentioned in any of the reports as an acquaintance or a witness or a person of interest. I went through all of the tip logs, and no one mentioned his name, so it was just a complete random encounter, I would suspect.
Number 3. Mary London. Mary London was a sweet and friendly 17-year-old teenager who lived in Sacramento, California. She was a sophomore at the local high school, and her family described her as being developmentally disabled. On January 14, 1981, Mary was reported missing by her family after she wasn't on her scheduled bus ride to the Sacramento high school. The following day, Mary's body was found by a passerby on a stretch of the San Juan Road, a local rural area. She was stabbed several times and sexually assaulted. According to Mary's friends and family, Mary grew up in foster care. Her daily routine was the same every week. Detectives determined that she was in school the day before she went missing. After school, Mary went to a friend's house. The friend told detectives that Mary had left her home to go and visit someone in downtown Sacramento. That friend saw her get on a city bus. Detectives also had a witness who saw Mary get off the bus in downtown Sacramento at 8th and K Streets. This was the last confirmed sighting of Mary. In the 1980s, there wasn't technology like we have today. Detectives talked to everyone who knew Mary and collected evidence carefully from the scene, including DNA from Mary's body. When DNA procedures advanced, the DNA collected from the crime scene was resubmitted in the early 2000s to try and find a match for a suspect. Unfortunately, there were no DNA matches in CODIS, so the case went cold again. After 35 years, the case was reopened in 2016 by the Sacramento Police Department detectives. According to a posting on their Facebook page, the detectives were asking for a community to help in finding a man named Daryl. He was a known friend of Mary's, however, he was not considered a suspect at the time. After submitting his DNA to CODIS, it was determined that Darrell did not murder Mary. 40 years after Mary's murder, detectives announced that they had found who murdered Mary. Detectives named Vernon Parker as Mary's killer. They had identified him using genetic genealogy and advanced DNA practices. Detectives learned during their investigation that Parker was involved in sex trafficking and a prostitution ring. According to detectives, Parker had been murdered in downtown Sacramento, about a block from where Mary had went missing, and they knew that was not a coincidence, as he was known to hang out in that area. While justice cannot be served, the determination and persistence of the Sacramento Police Department have given Mary's family closure.
Kirsten, we first told you about this story last night. The Sacramento Police Department will make the official announcement today, ending a 39-year-old cold case. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert says the breakthrough came with the use of new DNA technology. SACPD investigators worked closely with the district attorney's office to use the new tool and traditional DNA testing to link a man named Vernon Parker to the brutal murder of Mary London.
I mean, remember, we're in the midst of a crisis, but it's not going to stop us from solving crime, prosecuting crime, and doing what we have to do every day. It may look a little differently, and you might do a lot more Zoom meetings or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, the criminal justice system goes on.
Mary's half-sister Esther Snyder says Mary was a developmentally disabled 10th grade student at Sacramento High. She was living with foster parents and never came home on January 14, 1981. Her body was found the next morning on this then rural stretch of San Juan Road in North Sacramento. She'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed several times. It turns out Mary's killer was murdered in 1982, a little more than a year after her death. And now Snyder wants to thank investigators for their tireless work.
Thank God. I'm real happy they found somebody.
Coming up on Late News tonight, the detective who first worked the case meets Mary's families. The former 90-year-old detective says not even a global pandemic would keep him from celebrating this moment.
Today we're discussing the solved cold case of a serial predator that has recently been identified, arrested, and convicted. Let's get into it. From 1982 to 1985, a small town in Shelby County, Indiana, lived under a reign of terror when a vicious masked man broke into homes at night, armed with a gun or knife, and sexually assaulted women. Shelbyville was the center of all but one of the atrocious attacks. The town is about 30 miles southeast of Indianapolis and at the time had around 20,000 citizens. The series of crimes disturbed the town, and fear gripped the hearts of women for many years as that mysterious assailant remained at large. Gun sales skyrocketed, and even a local hospital offered shooting lessons to the residents. Police urged women to take extra precautions, and they were told to avoid being alone, make sure to close their curtains, lock their doors and windows at night, and alter their routines, as the authorities believed that the perpetrator stalked his victims before making his move. The nightmarish spree began on the night of August 14, 1982, when a woman woke up in the middle of the night after a man entered her home through an unlocked door. He held a knife to her throat, demanding money. He took some cash from her purse, then he threatened to hurt her young daughters, who were sleeping in the next room, if she didn't comply with his orders. He forced her to put on a nightgown and then proceeded to assault her. He knew that she was a recent divorcee and told her that her ex-husband paid him to intimidate her and teach her a lesson. He also threatened that he would come back to hurt and kidnap her daughters on their way home from school if she ever thought about reporting the incident to the police. A few months later, a similar incident took place. On the night of November 1st, 1982, the assailant forced his way into a home where a mother lived with her son. They were both awakened at knife point, and the man threatened to hurt the little boy if the mother didn't comply with him. He made her put on lingerie and perform sexual acts while her son watched before sexually assaulting her. Similar to the previous incident, he told the woman that he was paid to hurt her and that he would come back if she contacted the police. On December 16, 1982, a mother and her 16-year-old daughter were assaulted. The daughter was awake when a man entered her room holding a knife. He forced her to perform sexual acts before taking her to her mother's room. He also compelled the mother to perform sexual acts and assaulted her. He boasted about committing other attacks and claimed that he was a police officer. He also tried to take pictures of the two women using their personal camera, but discovered that there wasn't any film. A couple of months later, on February 2, 1983, the suspect armed with a gun attacked a man standing outside his home and forced him inside, where his wife was waiting. He forced the couple to perform sexual acts on each other and photographed them. He told them that he was being paid to do that and stole some cash before leaving the scene. After that incident, the police feared that the suspect's behavior was escalating. They first believed that he was primarily targeting recent divorcees and women living on their own, but the last incident showed that he didn't have a problem attacking couples or breaking into homes where men were present. Over a full year after his last attack, the perpetrator struck again. On February 18, 1984, a woman was in the shower when a man forced his way into her home. The woman was completely vulnerable, and when the man took her by surprise and held her at gunpoint, he asked her if she knew anything about his other attacks and bragged that the police had arrested the wrong guy. He told her that he would leave her alone if she cooperated with him and threatened to kill her if she screamed or struggled against him. He then proceeded to assault her and took multiple photographs of her. He had told her that they had met before and that she had served him at her job a few nights before. By saying that, he proved that he was used to stalking and keeping track of his victims' movements. He then left after stealing a small amount of cash. Then, on November 25, 1984, the assailant broke into another home. He first woke the victim's little daughter and took her to the mother's room. He held the daughter at gunpoint and used her to threaten the mother into performing sexual acts. He then assaulted the mother while her daughter watched and left after stealing some cash. He put his crime spree on hiatus until August 17, 1985, when he forced his way into a couple's home. He forced them at gunpoint to perform sexual acts on each other and demanded they give him money. The wife told him that she had a heart condition and then faked a heart attack. She aimed to get some sympathy, but unfortunately, their attacker had none. He first focused his attention on the male victim. He handcuffed him, tied him to a chair, and started to beat him mercilessly. He repeatedly hit him over and over again with the back of the gun, causing permanent brain damage and a coma that lasted for months. The victim had to get speech therapy to learn how to talk again. He currently suffers from many disabilities and is confined to a wheelchair. After leaving the husband for dead, he took the woman to the garage and sexually assaulted her. He threatened to come back and kill them if they went to the police. Little did he know that he made a fatal mistake that night, which would later lead to his arrest. Around this time, the authorities noted many similarities and links between the attacks, making them confident that they were all committed by one suspect. They knew from descriptions given by the victims that he always wore military-style boots, a chained wallet, and a ski mask. His MO involved sexually assaulting women, sometimes with an enema bottle, and he also used Vaseline in every attack. He would often tie his victims to immobilize them, and he would take or attempt to take photographs of them. And sometimes he would even have the audacity to ask his victims for a drink and would always threaten to come back if they contacted the police. He also had a pattern of stalking and observing his victims for several weeks before breaking into their homes, and he usually attacked after 9:30 p.m. and left the crime scene before 5:30 a.m. In 1985, the Indianapolis newspaper shared a facial composite of the suspect based on the victim's descriptions. And in the same article, task force detectives said the suspect was believed to be a white male, 5'9" to 6'1", 170 to 200 pounds with blue eyes, short to medium light brown or blonde hair, and that he was in his early to mid-30s. The victims also described him as muscular, so they believed he had an athletic body type. But despite all efforts, the suspect still managed to elude capture, and the authorities were unable to discover his identity. The culprit was generally very cautious and made sure never to leave behind anything that would lead to him. He always wore gloves, wiped down surfaces, and took all the items he touched or may have left DNA on with him, such as the victim's nightgowns, towels, and bed sheets. But one time he finally got sloppy and unknowingly left DNA behind, and that was in his final attack that took place on August 17, 1985. However, the case remained unsolved for decades, and it wasn't until 2020 that it finally had a breakthrough. A detective suggested sending the DNA sample extracted from the last crime scene to a company specializing in the same sort of DNA testing used to capture the Golden State Killer in 2018. A company called Parabon Nanolabs, a company based in Virginia that specializes in genealogical DNA identification and uses it to solve cold cases. The test results led to 2 men of the same family. One of them was Stephen Ray Hessler, an ex-convict who spent most of the 90s in prison for sexual assault convictions in a county close to Shelby County. He served about 10 years in prison and was released 2 months before inmates were required to submit DNA samples. Investigators started watching and digging into the lives of the 2 men, and it didn't take long for them to eliminate the first suspect, leaving only Stephen Ray Hessler. Hessler lived in Greensburg, Indiana, and used to pay his utility bills by mail. Police used that against him as they obtained an envelope he used to send a bill payment for his water bill. They extracted DNA from the licked envelope and compared his saliva to the DNA collected back in 1985. It was a perfect match. They brought him in for questioning, and they were able to obtain a better DNA sample from the inside of Hessler's cheek, further confirming the link. In the early morning hours on August 17, 2020, exactly 35 years after the last attack in Shelby County, police entered Hessler Greenberg's home with a search warrant. They described what they found inside as a treasure trove and a gold mine full of trophies and evidence from the crime scenes. They found several photographs that he had stolen from the victims, clothing and garments the victims described him wearing during the attacks, a chained wallet, ski mask, knives, handcuffs, and zip ties. They also found 30 pairs of women's underwear, an enema water bottle, petroleum jelly, Polaroid photos of the forced sex acts, and newspaper clippings of the articles written about the attacks. Police also searched his computers and found that he'd been researching the surviving victims' names and whereabouts. He'd also downloaded a Google Earth Street View photo of one of the victims' homes in Georgia. He'd also been similarly cyberstalking the victim of his sexual assault conviction. Stephen Ray Hessler was convicted on March 3, 2022, after an 8-day trial of 2 counts of sexual assault, 6 counts of unlawful deviant conduct, and 7 counts of burglary resulting in bodily injury, 3 counts of criminal deviant conduct, and 1 count of robbery, each a Class A felony. During the trial, the prosecution called 27 witnesses. Most of them were victims who bravely testified despite having received death threats. Some witnesses were flown in from as far as Florida, Georgia, and Ohio, as well as Secret Service computer technicians from the East Coast. Bradlin Warland, the Shelby County prosecutor, said,
Stephen Ray Hessler is one of the most evil, cruel, sadistic predators that I've had the pleasure of prosecuting in over 30 years. He is where he needs to be. He needs to stay in jail until it's time to put him in the ground.
During the trial, the prosecutor also described Hessler as a coward sadist. He clarified that Hessler is a sadist because he loves getting pleasure from hurting other people, and a coward because he could only do it when he was armed. On April 1, 2022, Stephen Ray Hessler was sentenced to 650 years in prison, 50 years for each crime. And finally, after nearly 4 decades, Hessler's victims are at peace, knowing their assailant would spend the rest of his life behind prison, where he belongs. It is a huge relief. I don't have to be afraid anymore, said the victim of the November 1, 1982 attack. She also encouraged all victims of sexual assault to always come forward. Today, we'll be discussing the recent discovery that baby Holly, missing for 42 years, has been found alive and well, and also the mystery surrounding the cold case murder of her parents. Let's get into it. In 1975, in New Smyrna, Florida, a young couple, 17-year-old Tina Gail Lynn and 21-year-old Dean Klaus, get married. High school sweethearts, the couple soon welcomed their daughter they named Holly. After Holly was born, the couple decided to relocate to Texas, where Dean had lined up a construction job and left behind their families. They packed up their car and set out to start their new lives in Texas. Initially, the couple kept in frequent contact with their families, but the calls and letters suddenly stopped. The last contact was in April of 1980. It wasn't initially thought of as a cause for concern, but Dean's family received a strange call. A woman who called herself Sister Susan said she was calling from Los Angeles, California. She told Donna that she had information about Tina and Dean, and that she was in possession of Dean's car and offered to bring the vehicle to Florida in exchange for $1,000. The car had been purchased by Donna and gifted to Dean for the move. Donna agreed to meet the woman, but also alerted authorities. They agreed to meet at the Daytona racetrack. The Klaus family was confused when 3 women in white robes, possibly one male, stepped out of the vehicle. Sister Susan told Donna that Dean and Tina had joined a religious group and did not want to be contacted by family members. She further stated that the couple had given up all of their possessions. The women were purportedly taken into custody, but no police report of the incident was ever found, and because the couple were adults, no investigation was taken at that time. Donna stated that she hadn't been surprised that Dean had joined a cult. He had expressed interest and had been involved in a different cult in Florida, but she thought that he'd put it past him when he married Tina. After this encounter, no one heard from Tina or Dean ever again. It was in 1981 in Houston, Texas, when 2 bodies were discovered in a wooded area. It was a man and woman found in a shallow grave, buried together. The cause of death was deemed to be homicide. The man appeared to have been beaten to death, while the woman had injuries consistent with strangulation, and in the grave was a bloody towel and green gym shorts. They estimated that they had been killed 2 months before the discovery. The bodies had no identification, and there weren't any missing person report that matched. Composite sketches were done and released to the media, but no one came forward. The bodies remained unidentified for decades. They were buried in the Harris County and were given the names Harris County Jane and John Doe. In 2021, Texas established a dedicated statewide cold case unit for the first time to start going through the 20,000 unsolved murders in the state. The cold case team started accepting cases in the fall of 2021, and one of the first cases they decided to open was that of the Harris County Jane and John Doe. They first decided to have the bodies exhumed in order to get DNA samples from the 2 of them. Genetic genealogy was done, and soon the bodies were identified as Tina and Dean Klaus, who had been missing since 1981. Law enforcement started their investigation, which led them to speak to the families of the deceased. Very quickly, they learned that the couple had a young daughter, and a search began to find baby Holly. Dean's mother said that she was devastated to learn that Dean and Tina had been murdered so soon after they stopped communication. Though she had missed her son over the years, she had hoped the family had been living out their lives, but had always feared the worst. Both Tina's family and Dean's family had never given up hope that they might one day have answers. Law enforcement from multiple agencies set to work trying to find Holly, and in June 2022 they made the discovery that no one had thought possible. Holly Klaus, now 42, was found in Oklahoma.
Investigators finding Holly this week in Oklahoma, telling her the truth about her biological parents. She's seen here holding a picture of them.
She has her mother's her mother's smile, and she has her mother's voice.
The Klaus and Lynn families meeting her for the first time this week on a video call.
When I looked at her, I remembered the times that I used to hold her in my arms. you know, and I just wanted to hug her. I just wanted to get up and hug her so bad, but it was Zoom and you can't.
Still, it is a bittersweet reunion. Authorities now want the public's help in finding whoever murdered Dean and Tina.
Some details have not been released to protect the ongoing investigation, but it was revealed that shortly after the murder of Tina and Dean, Holly had been left at a church in Arizona and adopted by the pastor and his wife of the church. They had renamed the infant. She never knew her birth name, birth family, or parents. Holly's adopted parents were not suspects. They revealed details about the circumstances that brought Holly to their front door. 2 women dressed in white robes and barefoot. They identified themselves as members of a nomadic religious group. The women spoke about their beliefs, saying that their religion included separating male and female members and practicing vegetarian habits. They also stated that their religion prevented them from wearing leather goods. These group members also indicated that they had previously given up another baby at a laundromat. Experts have identified the group as likely being the nomadic cult called Christ's Family, which had been led by Charles McHugh. The group had been known to wander the southern United States for years and had been active in Texas in 1981. The Texas General Attorney's Office went on to state that the members of the group are believed to have traveled to Arizona, California, and possibly Texas. The members of the nomadic group had been spotted in Yuma, Arizona during the 1980s, with the female members asking the public for food. McHugh, who called himself Lightning Amen, believed himself to be Jesus reincarnated and at the group's highest had 2,000 members. McHugh encouraged excessive drug use and demanded that members give up their former lives and earthly possessions. Children within the cult were viewed as excessive baggage, and it was required that all children be given up. If Tina and Dean had been involved with this or recruited into this cult, they would have been required to give up Holly, and it is still unknown what led to their deaths. The FBI had noted that this particular group as non-violent. However, the leader was seen as dangerous and unpredictable. McHugh had been arrested in 1985 for possession and transporting methamphetamines for the purpose of sale, as well as weapons charges. At his arrest, he was also found to be in possession of several weapons, various other drugs, and $4,200 in cash. He was convicted along with 4 other followers and went to prison for a bit. Another incident in 1985 was when 10 cult members were arrested for growing over $900,000 worth of cannabis at a compound in California. The cult broke up when McHugh was in prison. When he was released, he had a small following until his death in 2010, though there are still active members of Christ's Family. Holly, whose adopted name has been withheld to protect her family's privacy, has 5 children of her own and even is a grandmother. She has been reunited with her birth family, who has welcomed her return. Their reunification is being facilitated by experts. Family members are relieved that Holly had a good life and was well cared for all of these years.
We had nightmares, almost every night, wondering, what happened to Holly.
It is a question Debbie Brooks, Holly's aunt, and Donna Casasanta, Holly's grandmother, have been asking themselves for decades.
All kinds of things go through your mind, but you never or ever have rest.
This morning, after 40 years of searching, they can finally rest a bit easier with the answer.
And they called us and found Holly. That night I was able to go to bed.
The investigation into the murders of Dean and Tina Klaus is still ongoing. Little is known about what may have happened to the couple. Had they refused to give up Holly and was killed by McHugh or other members? The timeline puts the time of murder around the same time the car was returned to Florida. If anyone has information about their deaths, they are asked to please contact the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit.
In 1981, 2 deceased individuals were discovered in the wooded area in Houston, Texas. Their identities could not be determined at that time. What law enforcement did know is that they were likely murdered. Decades later, in 2021, the organization Identifiers International was able to positively identify the bodies that were found in 1981 through the use of genetic testing. The couple was from Florida, and their names were Tina Gail Lynn Klaus and Harold Dean Klaus. They were a young couple. We learned this couple had an infant daughter named Holly, who was not found with the remains of the Klauses. And so the search for baby Holly began. The Lynn and Klaus families have been searching for answers concerning the Klauses and their baby daughter Holly since they were last heard from in 1980. Last year, when the families learned that the two bodies found in Houston in 1981 were in fact Tina and Dean Klaus, the families began looking for answers as to what happened to baby Holly and the circumstances surrounding the deaths of the Klauses. Through collaborative efforts of the Texas Attorney General's Office Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit, the Louisville Police Department, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office in Florida, the Arizona Attorney General's Office, the Harris County Sheriff's Office, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I'm excited to announce that baby Holly has been located alive and well 42 years later. I also am happy to announce that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have offered and will be paying for Holly to be reunited in person with the Lynn and Klaus families. Holly has been notified of the identities of her biological parents and got to meet her extended biological for the family for the first time this Tuesday. They hope to meet in person soon, and NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is going to facilitate that meeting. This investigation highlights the hard work and collaboration of multiple law enforcement agencies working together across the country and demonstrates the importance of continuing to investigate cold cases both in Texas and in the United States. Now, this next part I'm sharing with you today because we're asking for help from the public because we have yet to solve this particular crime. While we rejoice today that Holly has been found and families that were looking for her for decades rejoice, we still are looking for suspects in this case. And I want to share that information with you, and I want to say this again. If you have information in this case, and I'm about to share some facts with you, but if you have information about this case, please contact the Texas Attorney General's Office Cold Case Unit at coldcaseunit@oag.texas.gov. That's coldcaseunit@oag.texas.gov. And our phone number as well for this investigation is 512-936-0742. The following information is released today regarding our investigation in hopes that people will hear this story and come forward with more information. Baby Holly was left at a church in Arizona and was taken into their care. Out of respect for Holly and her family, we won't have any further comments or details regarding that at this time. The family that raised Holly are not suspects in this case. Two women who identified themselves as members of a nomadic religious group brought Holly to the church. They were wearing white robes and they were barefoot. They indicated the beliefs of their religion included the separation of male and female members, practicing vegetarian habits, and not using or wearing leather goods. The women indicated they had given up a baby before at a laundromat. It is believed that this particular group traveled around southwestern United States, including Arizona, California, and possibly Texas. There were sightings of this religious group around the Yuma, Arizona area in the early 80s. The women members would be seen around town at various points asking for food. In late December 1980 or early January 1981, the families of Tina Lynn Klaus and Harold Dean Klaus received a phone call from someone identifying herself as Sister Susan, who explained she was calling from Los Angeles, California, and wanted to return Tina and Dean's car to their family. She further stated that Tina and Dean had joined their religious group and no longer wanted to have contact with their families. They were also giving up all of their possessions. Sister Susan asked for money in exchange for returning the car to Florida where the family lived. The family agreed but contacted the local authorities about the situation. The family agreed to meet Sister Susan at the Daytona racetrack in Florida. The family described meeting 2 to 3 women and possibly one male, and once again, these women were wearing robes and appeared to be members of this religious group. The police purportedly took the women into custody, but there's no record of a police report on file that has been found as of yet. Given the age of this case, that is common. We're still on the hunt for that police report. The return car belonged to Dean's mother and was, in fact, the car that they had in their possession. And this is the description of the vehicle. It's a 1978 two-door red burgundy AMC Concorde. Tina Lynn Klaus and Harold Dean Klaus were likely murdered between December 1980 or early January 1981. Their bodies were found off of Wallaceville Road in Harris County, Texas. I'm going to repeat that. Their bodies were found off of Wallaceville Road in Harris County, Texas. And this was between January 6th and January 11th of 1981. They were last heard from by their families in late October 1980, and they had been living in Louisville, Texas in October of 1980, around that time. If you have any information regarding these murders, we ask that you come forward, even if it's a piece of information that may not be concrete evidence. We need to find pieces of the puzzle to solve this crime. The Texas AG's Office Cold Case Unit and the law enforcement agencies that work with us are committed to bringing justice in this case. We wish Holly the best. We're grateful that we found her, but we must continue with our purpose of finding who murdered this couple.
Today we'll be discussing a serial killer in Colorado that plagued the community of Aurora and Lakewood before abruptly disappearing. That killer was recently identified. On January 10, 1984, Patricia Louise Smith was sitting down for lunch. The 51-year-old interior decorator was in Lakewood, Colorado, and helping her recently divorced daughter get settled with her 2 young children. Originally from Nebraska, the family was settling into their new life in Colorado. Patricia was alone at home. Her grandkids were at school, and her daughter was at work. Later that day, Patricia's daughter Sherry was waiting for Patricia at the park and ride. Patricia normally picked her up right after work, and it immediately concerned Sherry when she wasn't there. Sherry waited around for a little while and then called her cousin, who came to pick her up. Then the 2 of them collected Sherry's kids before heading home. Once there, they noticed that there weren't any lights on in the home. It was mostly dark now, and from the driveway all Sherry could see was light from a TV flickering in her mother's bedroom. She entered the home, turned on the light, and found her mother lying on the floor. Sherry said she immediately knew her mother was deceased. Sherry grabbed her kids, who had been the first to enter the home, and they ran over to neighbors to call the police. Patricia had been covered with a blanket. She had been viciously beaten. The murder weapon had been determined to be a hammer, and she had also been sexually assaulted. It had been a brutal murder and one that shook the community. Detectives determined that the killer had entered the home via the garage and believed that the attack had happened sometime midday, as it appeared Patricia had been about to eat lunch. The home had also been ransacked, and contents of Patricia's purse had been dumped out, and a hammer was found next to Patricia. Other evidence collected from the scene was Patricia's clothing, the blanket, and the carpet underneath her body for later examination. The investigation had puzzled detectives. No one in the surrounding townhomes had heard or seen anything suspicious. They had just moved to Colorado, so they didn't believe that it was someone who knew Patricia or her family. The killer appeared to have just walked in and out in broad daylight without anyone noticing. Patricia's murder had followed a series of attacks only days before. On January 4th, a couple, Kim and Jim Habenshield, had a bizarre break-in and attack in Aurora, Colorado.
It was the middle of the night 2 weeks ago when a man entered this house through the garage. When he left, the man and woman who live here had been beaten on the head with a hammer. They are Kim and Jim. We withheld their last names. They're convinced their attacker is the same man who killed the 3 members of the Bennett family.
Because basically a hammer was used for one thing, and from what detectives have said, that the person that has done some of the other crimes has been described in the same manner as what I have described. As far as I know, nobody's seen his face. They've just been able to describe the build and the color and such.
Do you have any idea why he broke in here, what his motive was?
I just thought it was money, quick cash or something, because he didn't take any of the rings or jewelry or nothing like that. He did steal her purse, so we thought it was just quick money, but I think he's just, either out to rape or just to hurt people.
The couple awoke to have been attacked by a man wielding a hammer. When the couple started screaming, the man threw the hammer and ran out of the house. He had also entered the home through an open garage and had stolen Kim's purse. The hammer had been a standard hardware store claw hammer. Similar to Patricia's murder, no prints were found, which led detectives to believe the attacker had worn gloves. The couple had been extremely disoriented when they finally realized there was a man in their bedroom. They hadn't even initially realized they both had injuries. They were both bleeding heavily but didn't notice for several minutes. They described their attacker as a large man, but it had been too dark to see any details. The man hadn't said anything before running out of the house. Officers traced footprints in the snow from their house to a neighbor's house, and it was theorized that the perpetrator had been going door to door looking for homes that were unlocked. Then back in Aurora, Colorado, authorities linked another attack similar to the Habenshields that had occurred hours after Patricia had been murdered. Donna Dixon, a flight attendant, had been attacked in her garage by a man with a hammer. Her attacker had been hiding in her garage and had hit her on the temple as she'd been getting out of her car after work. The injury had rendered her unconscious. She had been found still alive by her boyfriend, who was a pilot and had ended his shift in the early morning hours the following day. He found Donna in their bedroom, covered in blood, with a huge injury to the side of her head. Donna had been rushed to the hospital, where she was able to recover, but detectives had to deliver the horrible news that she'd been sexually assaulted by her attacker.
Well, we met obviously in the airlines.
Ron Holm was a pilot, Donna Dixon a flight attendant.
I said, you want to learn to play tennis? Because I was a good tennis player.
But the relationship was slow to get off the ground.
He asked me out 2 years before we started dating.
And the second time I asked her out if she wanted to play racquetball, because I was a good racquetball player.
I don't do
She
sports.
said no.
Finally,
Daddy asked me out actually for drinks.
a yes.
I can handle that.
Drinks turned into dating, and that turned into living together and talking marriage. Then came January 9th, 1984.
Things were just normal.
Ron was on an overnight flight. Donna ran errands, returning home after dark and pulling into the garage.
I know I'm safe. I'm home. I reach and grab the mail, swing the door open, and that's where my memory goes. It's now erased.
Erased by a man with a hammer. He beat her unconscious, sexually assaulted her, and left her for dead. One of 4 hammer attacks that month in the metro area.
When I come to, I'm thinking, I must have really tied one on. But I'm outside of the house trying to get in and falling down, standing up, falling down.
Somehow, she made it inside. Ron got home the next day.
There's blood on the stoop, so I ran inside, ran over into the bedroom, and I saw her laying in bed with all this blood.
In the hospital, I say I had the mentality of a 2-year-old. Everything was new to me. Once again, I didn't know a knife and fork. I couldn't even tell you that I can't open my mouth and how hard it is to eat.
They married in the midst of rehabilitation and recovery, a wig over her scarred, bald head, her brain slowly healing.
As I would see a daddy long leg, and it's a long leg daddy. Why would you want to get blood from a turnip? So how would you know that phrase, right?
A year and 9 days after nearly dying, Donna returned to work. It was a lot longer before seeing strangers no longer scared her.
You always felt like, is it him? Does he recognize me? Is he going to come after me again?
Even as the attack went unsolved, they built a busy, happy life.
My efforts were not to hate him specifically, although he's an evil person. My efforts went towards helping Donna recover and being there for her.
Due to how much blood was found in the concrete, Donna had been left for dead in the garage. It was estimated she'd been there for several hours. but it had been the cold Colorado winter temperatures that had saved Donna from bleeding out. When news got out that Donna lived through the attack, Donna's boyfriend was terrified someone would come back to finish the job, and he slept with a gun for months afterward. The first thing Donna remembered was waking up on the garage floor. She still had her house keys in her hand from when she'd gotten out of the car. She had no idea what had happened and started vomiting, which she attributed to drinking too much in the state of shock that she was in. She could only focus on how cold she was, both from the open garage door and the shock from the injury. She got into the house and made her way to the bedroom, where she laid down until her boyfriend came home. Again, a hammer was found in the garage, and Donna's purse had cash stolen from it. Then, on January 16th, the Aurora Police Department got a call for the most horrific and violent attack yet. Bruce and Deborah Bennett worked together at a furniture warehouse, and it was when neither of them showed up for work that morning that drew a cause for concern. The couple were always extremely reliable, and when their work called their house, no one picked up, which was also very unusual. One of their co-workers got in touch with Bruce's mother, Connie, and asked if she knew where they were. Connie also called the Bennetts, and when no one answered, she got in her car and drove over. When she arrived at the house, she noticed the garage door had been left open. Additionally, both of their vehicles were still parked where they normally were. As she got out of the car, she got closer to the home. She immediately knew something was wrong. Deborah's purse had been dumped out in front of the home. Then she said that the door from the garage into the home had been left ajar. She entered the home and immediately saw Bruce's body in the living room. There was blood everywhere, and she knew her son was deceased. It had been such a shock for Connie, as the family had been celebrating her granddaughter Vanessa's birthday the night before. There were still birthday plates on the kitchen counter. Law enforcement descended on the home. Bruce was found in the living room, but evidence had shown that the attack had started in the couple's bedroom. Bruce had fought the attacker despite a severe head injury. Several spindles from the banister had been knocked out during the struggle. The fight had ended in the living room, where Bruce's throat was slashed. Deborah's body was found in the bedroom. She had been attacked with a hammer and sexually assaulted. The couple had 2 daughters. Melissa, 8 years old, was found in the bedroom deceased. The youngest daughter, 3-year-old Vanessa, was found wedged in between the bed and the wall with significant injuries to her entire body, and in a shock to everyone, was still breathing. Vanessa was rushed to the hospital, where she was treated for a broken arm, skull fracture, shattered jaw, and several broken ribs. She was in a coma for days after the attack, and it would take her years before she recovered physically enough to leave the hospital. Both of the little girls had been sexually assaulted by the attacker.
She was the youngest victim of one of Colorado's most horrific crimes. Just 3 years old when a monster with a hammer broke into her family's home. Just 3 when that madman caved in her skull with a hammer and left her for dead.
It's possible that she could be left with significant permanent injury. It's too early to tell.
In those first bewildering days in January 1984, her very survival sparked hope in her grandmother.
Vanessa is making such good progress, and she's going to be okay. We thank God.
A mountain of evidence was collected from the home. Deborah's purse, DNA evidence left behind in both bedrooms, the knife that had been used on Bruce was found in the snow in the front yard, and a hammer was also discovered. It had been a horrific massacre, one that didn't make sense to anyone. No one had heard a thing. Law enforcement had estimated the time of attack, sometime between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., and none of their neighbors heard anything. Bruce's brother had been at the birthday party the night before, and he remembered as he was leaving that the garage door was open. He went in and let Bruce know to close it before he left around 9 p.m. He'd left after that, and didn't know if Bruce closed it before going to bed.
Police say that sometime between 9 last night and early this morning, the Bennett family was brutally attacked with a blunt instrument and a knife. probably this one found in the snow covering their front lawn. Dead are 27-year-old Bruce Bennett, his 26-year-old wife Deborah, and one of their 2 daughters, 8-year-old Melissa. She and her mother were found in their bedrooms. A coroner says at least one of them, Melissa, appears to have been sexually assaulted. Bruce Bennett was found lying near a stairwell. Police say all of them were wearing their sleeping clothes. One of the bystanders here this morning was a friend since 8th grade and Bruce Bennett's best man at his wedding. A friend who said no one hated the Bennetts this much.
No, he doesn't have any enemies. There's no way. Bruce is the best kind of guy you could know. There's no way he could have any kind of enemies like this.
Police say they haven't uncovered any signs of a forced entry into this home, but they aren't ruling out the possibility that someone or some people forced their way in. You wouldn't think it would happen here, one man said. Paula Woodward has more about the Bennett family.
It's the type of neighborhood you think of when you're talking about life in the suburbs. Nice, quiet, friendly, young couples, young kids, safe.
It's scary.
Tell me about that.
Well, I don't know. If it's family related, I feel a little bit more safe, but if it was done by an outsider, then it would really scare me.
They were real nice, everyday people. Deborah was happy-go-lucky, Bruce the quiet type. They worked in downtown Denver, both of them at the same place.
4 days ago, they were in my house. They bought this house only about 3-4 weeks ago. They're good people. I don't understand what happened.
They had just moved into their new house over Thanksgiving. They had lived about 6 miles away, still in Aurora before then. Their oldest daughter, Melissa, died with them. She was a 2nd grader at Fulton Elementary.
I know that she was an excellent student, that she cared about the other kids in her classroom. The teacher cared about her very much, and I know she was planning a birthday party for tomorrow with her mother and with a teacher.
Shock, sadness, outrage, and fear. A school principal tries to figure out how to tell Melissa's classmates. A mother how to tell her daughter her friend is dead.
Tracy was supposed to go to a birthday party there Friday night. But, you know, I guess she can't now.
Paula Woodward, 9 News.
It wasn't long before investigators tied the crimes together. With how investigations were conducted at the time, they were all given to different departments and assigned to different detectives who did their own investigations. So there wasn't a collaborative effort to find this man. We saw this happen with the investigation of the Golden State Killer. Joseph James D'Angelo, being an ex-cop, knew what it was like between different police departments and that there really wasn't any system in place to work cooperatively. This was why he attacked in different areas all the time and how he got away with so many of his attacks. In this case, there were key similarities between all of the attacks: the hammer, the high-risk blitz-style attack, getting into homes via open garages, and stealing and robbing of purses. And in each of the attacks, all the homes had been in newly constructed subdivisions. An FBI profile was done of the unknown attacker. The FBI felt that they were looking for a young man because the attacks didn't seem sophisticated or well thought out. All of the crimes had been messy. He'd left evidence behind, which led agents to believe this was an inexperienced killer. The attacks had followed a textbook escalation of violence, from attacking a couple and letting them live, to sexual assault and attempted murder, to the violent murder, and then the slaughtering of an entire family. The FBI also thought they were looking for someone who worked in construction, as newly built developments had been consistent with the victims. They also felt that all the victims were random, chosen out of convenience. Who knows how many homes he would try before finding ones with the doors unlocked. The attacker never broke into any of the homes, always entering where garages were open and the doors into the homes were unlocked. The weapons were also notable. All the hammers were different. Some were older than others, some were construction, some were more of a basic home tool, and others were specialized. But he always brought them to the crime scene. The only weapon that had been used from inside a home was the kitchen knife used to kill Bruce Bennett. The crimes had all happened in such a quick succession, and the killer had attacked every week in January, and the communities surrounding Detroit braced for more attacks. But they never came. As quickly as the attacks had started, they just stopped. On January 26, 1985, in Kingsman, Arizona, Roy Williams was attacked in the middle of the night. An unknown attacker had come into his home through an unlocked back door, and Roy was awakened to a man standing over him with a rock in his hand. The man sent the rock crashing down onto his skull, but it didn't knock him out. A second blow came down, but the attacker dropped it, and instead of hitting his head for a second time, it landed on his chest, breaking a rib. Roy was able to get up and chase the man out of his house. Police came and investigated, but there had been little to go on. Roy couldn't identify his attacker because it had been too dark. What investigators did find was a very distinct set of shoe prints leading out of Roy's house. The shoe prints were so detailed, detectives could make out a number 9 indicating the shoe size. Their suspect had been wearing a size 9 tennis-style shoe. Officers in the area received a bolo, which included a photograph of the shoe tread. And later that day, an officer on patrol saw a man hitchhiking and pulled him over to talk to him. They talked for a couple of minutes. The man said he was unemployed and said he was from California and looking to hitchhike back. Then the officer asked to see the bottom of his shoes. The officer noticed a similarity between the treads and asked to be come down to the police station. The officer hadn't expected this man to bolt. The man was caught 30 minutes later trying to hide. He was identified as 23-year-old Alex Christopher Ewing. He was charged with attempted murder and burglary for the attack against Roy Williams. He was held in jail while he waited trial.
Early on a Friday morning in January 1984 in Kingman, Arizona, Roy Williams woke suddenly to a 25-pound rock smashing into him, breaking a rib, tearing open his head.
And at first I thought somebody just punched me right in the chin or something.
Then the shadowy figure vanished into the desert. 7 hours later, a cop stopped a hitchhiker and started asking questions. The man bolted and was later captured in a nearby canyon. It was Alex Christopher Ewing. His arrest was front-page news. He faced a trial, maybe some years in prison, and that might have been the end of the story.
9 months later, on August 9th, Ewing was put on a prison transport bus for his first court date. The bus stopped for gas near Henderson, Nevada, and while correction officers weren't looking, Ewing made a run for it. Law enforcement searched all night, but weren't able to locate the missing felon. Then, the following day, they started receiving calls from residential neighborhoods with reports of a man trying to break into homes. Then later that evening, they received a chilling 911 call. Christopher Berry and his wife Nancy had turned in for the night. The couple had 2 children. One was an infant, and Nancy got up to prepare a bottle. When she turned the light on in the kitchen, she screamed when she saw a man standing there with a broken axe handle. Nancy ran back towards the bedroom where the man followed and then started to attack Christopher with the axe handle. Nancy tried to help her husband by blocking some of the attacks. Both of her wrists were broken in the process. She also had a fracture in her arm. Christopher suffered extensive injuries to his face and jaw. Nancy had been able to reach for the telephone and dial 911. The attacker just kept hitting her over and over until she eventually pretended to be dead, and he suddenly left the room. Law enforcement again descended on the home in full force. Christopher and Nancy were rushed to the hospital. Their children had been unharmed. Christopher would suffer permanent damage from the attack and never fully recover. Ewing was not found that night, having eluded officers again. 2 days later, on August 11th, a collect call is placed from a payphone in Lake Mead, Nevada. The operator hears a portion of the call, where the man on the other end describes escaping prison and needing help. The operator then calls law enforcement, who rush to the area. Law enforcement, along with park rangers, spot Ewing still at the payphone. Ewing had called his brother. He was only wearing a pair of maroon shorts. He didn't look well. It appeared that the scorching Nevada heat had been catching up with him. He was sunburned, covered in scrapes and scratches. When Ewing saw park rangers approaching him, he tried to run, but he only got a few hundred yards away before collapsing. He was severely dehydrated, and his body wasn't able to go any further. He was recaptured, and he had multiple charges added to his already multiple charges. In 1985, he went to trial for the attacks against the Berries. He was convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder, burglary, and escape, and handed a 110-year sentence. The charges from Roy Williams' attack were dropped because he was already sentenced to multiple decades in prison and should have stayed there for the rest of his life. However, in 2020, Alex Ewing became eligible for parole due to overcrowding, giving Ewing the first taste of freedom in 35 years. But what Ewing didn't know was that during a mandated collection of DNA from Nevada inmates, his DNA linked him to his crimes in Colorado: the murders of the Bennett family, Patricia Smith, and the sexual assault of Donna Dixon.
I wake up thinking about it.
I think about it every day.
2 women bound by fate.
It's a travesty of justice.
And by frustration that a suspect identified more than a year ago in 2 of Colorado's most notorious murder cases remains in Nevada.
I'd like to see him sitting in front of a judge.
A judge here in Colorado.
How can this be happening?
It was January 10th, 1984 that a man with a hammer raped Sherry Letton's mother and beat her to death in Lakewood. Patricia Louise Smith was 50. 6 days later in Aurora, a man with a hammer killed Connie Bennett's son Bruce, his wife Deborah, and their daughter Melissa. Only 3-year-old Vanessa survived, barely. For nearly 35 years, there were no answers.
A break in a murder case.
And then,
cold for more than 3 decades.
In August 2018,
that we believe Mr. Ewing is responsible.
A suspect identified through DNA, Alex Christopher Ewing, a Nevada inmate serving time for an attack there.
We will be going to the governor's office and requesting that Mr. Ewing be extradited from the state of Nevada. This matter could take anywhere from a couple of weeks to perhaps a month or 2. We just don't know.
Mr. Ewing, the court has received a demand for your surrender to authorities in the state of Colorado. Do you object to being turned over to Colorado authorities?
I would like to file an extradition.
Since then, his attorney has engineered multiple delays as he appealed. A request for 30 days because his assistant had been in an automobile accident several blocks from the law office. For an additional 11 days because of extraordinary circumstances and extreme need. For 60 more days because he had been unable to complete the daunting task of preparing a brief. The Nevada Supreme Court denied the last request 65 days after it was made, leaving Sherry Letton and Connie Bennett disgusted with the process and with Ewing himself.
And the excuses are nothing short of, my dog ate my homework.
That guy in Nevada, I think he's a waste of oxygen in this world.
I'm looking forward to getting through this and seeing justice done for my family, for my mother. We lost a mother, a wife, a grandmother. We've missed 35 years of having this beautiful woman in our life.
The Colorado District Attorney scrambled to get Ewing extradited to Colorado so he could be charged in connection with the string of attacks from 1984, and after 2 years, he finally gets Ewing back in Colorado, eliminating any chance of parole for Ewing. Unfortunately, charges couldn't be brought forward in Donna's attack, nor his first attack on the Habenshields due to the statute of limitations being up on both of those crimes. But DNA linked him to the Bennett murders as well as Patricia Smith, which the DA opted to try those cases separately. The charges related to the Bennett murders came first, since it had the most evidence. And during that investigation, they learned that Ewing matched the first FBI profile to a T. Ewing had been a high school dropout from Sacramento, California. He traveled to Colorado, where he lived there for about a year and worked in construction, particularly new builds. He had worked in several of the developments that he had chosen to find victims in. At the time of the attacks, he'd been 23. But Ewing hadn't been what detectives had been expecting. Ewing was 5'6", he had a small frame, and now 61, he had seemed quite frail. Hardly what they expected from a man they'd been searching for almost 4 decades. He didn't seem capable of the brutal assaults inflicted on his victims. But while they interviewed him, he had displayed seething rage, and the facade of the frail old man had disappeared. If Alex Ewing were to ever be released, they were certain he would kill again. He also had a violent criminal history dating back to 1979 for several burglaries. He had previously been in jail for those crimes, and he'd only just been released in 1984 when he started the killing spree in Colorado. The trial for the Bennett murders began in August 2021, and the jury deliberated for 2 days before coming back with a guilty verdict on all counts and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Then, in April 2022, the trial for Patricia's murder. This time the jury only deliberated for 4 hours before handing down a unanimous guilty verdict, adding another life sentence and eliminating any possibility of parole.
For a 2018 DNA match led investigators to him. DNA was at the center of the opening statement, the prosecutor arguing that the presence of Ewing's semen at the scene shows that he committed the crime, and a defense attorney asserted that other physical evidence points to someone else as the killer.
By the end of the case, it's all going to link up. It's all going to show that the defendant is the person who did this.
It doesn't make sense because it ignores that the physical evidence points to someone else. Their theory is wrong, and their theory does not make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because Alex Ewing did not kill Patricia Smith, did not rape Patricia Smith, and is not guilty.
Ewing was convicted in August of killing Bruce and Deborah Bennett and their daughter Melissa in Aurora, a week after Patricia Smith's murder. He's serving 3 life sentences for those murders.
There was a sense of relief from Ewing's surviving victims. Connie Bennett said of Ewing, "Some people may call him an animal, but I won't because I think animals have a purpose in this world." Vanessa Bennett also made several statements outlining the pain and suffering she had in her life due to the lasting physical and emotional pain she had been in since January 16, 1985, when her whole life changed.
I don't remember anything at all, honestly. People ask me all the time if I remember things, but I don't.
Today, Vanessa Bennett is okay, but not entirely okay.
I have a metal plate in my forehead. I had frontal lobe issues because I was hitting the hammer. My skull kind of breaks right here. My jaw pretty much is shattered. I had a tracheotomy here. I have a shattered pelvis. But I guess I healed pretty well.
Her childhood was difficult.
I was made fun of in school because my parents were killed. I was made fun of because the hammerman, or whatever you want to call it, was gonna come to my house and hurt everybody when I had slumber parties and stuff. I was made fun of for a long time.
Adulthood has been even harder.
I had issues with my grandmother growing up because of my, anger issues, and I was hurt growing up. She was hurt. And
Today we are discussing 4 more cold cases that were recently solved with DNA evidence. Number 1, Kim Bryant and Diana Hansen. Last August we covered the case of Las Vegas teen Stephanie Isaacson, who had been murdered in a random attack while she was walking to school. Her case was solved after 32 years thanks to the generous donation that funded the advanced genetic genealogy testing that had been instrumental in solving the case. Her killer, Darren Roy Marchand, had committed suicide 9 years after the slaying. His DNA profile had also connected him to another unsolved cold case. He had been a long-time Las Vegas resident, but had never been a suspect in either case. The generous donation had been provided by local businessman Justin Wu, who has since gone on to fund several more cases, and similar to the identification of Darren Roy Marchand, Wu's funding has closed 2 cold cases, both perpetrated by the same killer, and possibly another 5. Because of this donation, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department may have identified a serial killer active in the area in the 70s and 80s. The first case that was solved was that of Kim Bryant, a 16-year-old who was abducted from a Dairy Queen parking lot on January 26, 1979. The Dairy Queen was across the street from her high school, and she was waiting there for her boyfriend to pick her up. When he arrived, he noted that Kim was nowhere to be seen, but didn't think too much of it. Kim had been abducted around 9 a.m. and wasn't reported missing until late afternoon when she didn't return home from school. An extensive investigation of the teen was conducted, but there had been little to go on. Officers had one witness who said they saw Kim waiting and then saw 2 young males drive past, talk to her for a moment, and then drive away shouting obscenities at her. Those young men had never been identified, but officers had the make and model of the vehicle. Additionally, they also released a sketch to the media. A month after her disappearance, 3 boys made a grisly discovery while hiking. Kim's body was discovered in a desert area in a shallow grave. She had been brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and the cause of her death was noted as blunt force trauma. The investigation went on for several months, but eventually, leads dried up and the case went cold. Throughout the years the case was re-examined, law enforcement from the original investigation had preserved a DNA sample, and it was kept in storage for many years, but over time the sample began to degrade, making it more challenging to extract a full DNA profile using modern equipment. In 2021, while re-examining the evidence, they found a new sample on Kim's clothing and were able to get a full DNA profile and upload it into the national databases. This had renewed hopes of finding her killer, and it had been the first time they were able to get a full profile for comparison. Unfortunately, there were no hits. In 2021, after the success of finding Stephanie Isaacson's killer, Justin Wu offered to fund more cases, covering the costly expense of sending DNA samples to private labs in order to have an advanced genetic genealogy profile done. Kim's case would be one of those in the next round of cold cases to be sent off to Othram Labs. It took nearly a year, but finally Othram was able to narrow in on several close relatives of the suspect. In October 2021, LVMPD reached out to the closest relative and asked for a DNA sample to compare, and that relative agreed to submit their DNA for comparison. It was in November 2021 they finally had an identification. Kim Bryant's killer had been Johnny Blake Peterson, who had been 19 at the time of Kim's murder. Johnny had also attended the same high school as Kim, but he'd graduated a few years before she did, and it is unclear if the two knew each other. Peterson had never been identified as a suspect, however he had been arrested for sexual assault but never convicted, and it appeared the case against him had been dropped. Peterson lived in Las Vegas his whole life. He worked in construction as a plasterer and a general contractor. He had married and had 2 children, but died under mysterious circumstances in 1993 at the age of 32. His cause of death could not be determined. When LVMPD uploaded Peterson's DNA into the national databases, they were surprised when his DNA matched another cold case from Las Vegas. On December 31, 1983, 22-year-old Diana Hansen was abducted while jogging in western Las Vegas. Diana was a college student from Texas visiting family over the winter break. Similar to Kim's abduction, it had been quick without any witnesses. She'd been reported missing later that day, but maybe because of her age and that she wasn't a resident or that it was New Year's Eve, there wasn't as large of an immediate sense of urgency with the investigation that we saw with Kim's. There is barely any information about her disappearance available. The following day, her body was discovered in another remote area near where she'd been abducted. She had been sexually assaulted, but in escalation of violence from Kim's murder, Diana had been stabbed to death. Diana's murder investigation quickly went cold. No one in the area had seen anything suspicious, and it wasn't clear exactly where Diana was jogging, so they couldn't even narrow down where they would be looking for an abduction site. There was little evidence to go on, and the case had remained unsolved for decades. It had only taken a week from Johnny Peterson's identification as Kim Bryant's killer for Diana's cold case to be solved. LVMPD is looking at 5 other cold cases that have similar patterns as Kim and Diana's cases. They believe Peterson could be linked to several more killings, with a wide time frame of 1975 to 1993, opening up the possibility that Peterson could have been a serial killer in the area. Christina Burlingham, Eve Provenzano, Terry Dietrich, and Mary Beth DeVito were all young women who had been abducted and murdered in the same window of time.
The sexual assaults and murders of 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson, 16-year-old Kim Bryant, and 22-year-old Diana Hansen were all recently solved thanks to donor dollars, a private citizen giving money to Metro, a public agency, to pay for highly specialized DNA testing in cold cases.
The families have gone for 40 years wondering who killed their loved one.
Police discovered Kim Bryant and Diana Hansen had been killed by the same man, Johnny Blake Peterson, who died in 1993.
Certainly when you're going forth with the work, you don't know how it's going to pan out. This suspect may not be deceased, he may be living right next to you. So it's always worthy of a department's greatest effort in my opinion, and that bottom shelf that often gets put on, that's not where it belongs.
Lieutenant Sean Comiskey retired last year from Metro's cold case sex assault unit. He says a tough reality hides behind the recent successful solves. Units are understaffed.
For years, we've been working homicide cold cases with a team of 5 part-time investigators.
And underfunded.
And our focus right now is reducing violent crime. And we spend a significant amount of money on our current homicide investigations. So with that being said, we still have set aside our own dollars where we investigate our cold cases. The fact that we've had generous donations come in has allowed us to have money that we otherwise would not have.
Number 2, Christy Ellen Bryant. On July 31, 1974, 22-year-old Christy Ellen Bryant had been working an overnight shift alone at a 7-Eleven store in National City, a city within the San Diego region. Christy was from Florida and had come to California to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps. An injury sustained in a car accident in 1972 had ended her military career. Christy was described as a very friendly person who was always willing to lend a hand where needed. Sometime in the early morning hours, Christy was attacked. Her body was found hours later when the next worker arrived and discovered the front doors to the convenience store were locked. He then discovered Christy's body covered in blood. Her cause of death was determined to have been several stab wounds, but based on the evidence, it appeared that Christy had put up one hell of a fight. They determined a significant amount of blood from her attacker at the scene. Despite an exhaustive investigation, no suspects were identified for nearly 5 decades. There had been no witnesses and nothing to aid in the investigation. In 2008, the suspect's DNA was uploaded to the national databases, but no leads were generated from that. In 2012, 2015, and 2016, detectives tested the DNA against all California's databases from their Department of Justice, hoping to get a familial match, but again, nothing came up. The case was passed on to San Diego's Cold Case Investigation Unit, and with the help of grant funding, they were able to submit the DNA for advanced genetic genealogy testing. In the fall of 2021, they identified a suspect, 69-year-old Carlin Edward Cornet. They surveilled him and collected a sample of DNA for comparison and were able to connect him to Christie's killer. Officers arrived at his home in Las Vegas and arrested him without incident. He was extradited to San Diego, where he has pleaded not guilty. Cornet had never been a suspect in the slaying, nor did he have any criminal history. At this time, it is unclear when his next trial date is. Christie's father and sister made a statement to the media. Her sister has vowed to attend every court date Cornet has. Holly Bryant stated to the media, I do want him to pay for what he did, and I hope his family can accept it as well. Number 3. Natalie Shublin. On June 10, 1971, Raymond Shublin returned to his home in Bedford, Massachusetts. He noticed his wife, 54-year-old Natalie's car, wasn't parked in the driveway. He entered the home and noted immediately that something wasn't right. Unable to find his wife, he searched the home from top to bottom, and when he went down to the basement, he made the horrible discovery. Natalie was found with her legs bound, she had been gagged, and had multiple stab wounds, and had a significant trauma to her head. Raymond immediately called the police, who were able to arrive on the scene in minutes. A medical examiner determined that Natalie had been killed a short time from when she was discovered. Her husband was ruled out as a suspect. Detectives located her car that evening, which had been abandoned nearby. They noted that the car had been wiped down, but they were able to find several good fingerprints in the car. It was never clear why Natalie had been attacked. She'd been a housewife in the suburban area for most of her life. She had 2 adult children that had moved out from the home. The only thing taken was the car, which had been abandoned. Raymond was the president of a bank, but according to him, he couldn't think of anyone in his life or that he had encountered that would be a danger to himself or his family. In 1999, detectives uploaded the fingerprint into the then state-of-the-art FBI fingerprint database, AFIS. A thumbprint found in the car was matched to Arthur Lewis Massey. Massey was interviewed by detectives who initially denied ever being to Bedford, but then later said he'd been asked to murder a banker's wife by an organized crime group. He said he turned down the job. Massey had a long criminal history, mostly dealing in bank fraud, armed robbery, and assaults. It may have been his incarceration that led to a lack of urgency in this case, we're not exactly sure. Massey was interviewed again in 2005, and this time he said that he knew who carried out the murder of Natalie Shublin, the woman he said he previously didn't know. He said he had been approached by a criminal organization and was told that a banker wanted his wife whacked and was willing to pay a large sum to have it done. He said that he declined the offer, but his cousin, who at this time was deceased, had carried out the contract. Bedford police want it to be clear that Raymond Shublin was never a suspect in his wife's death, nor has there ever been any evidence that has indicated he had been involved in a murder conspiracy to kill his wife. There's been no evidence that has ever supported Massey's claims. In 2019, detectives again re-examined the case and located a woman that had been connected to Massey's fraud crimes. She told detectives that Massey regularly carried a knife and that he had told her that he had killed someone with that knife. She also had information that had never been released to the public. Information she said had directly come from Massey. That, along with the other evidence collected that tied Massey to the murder of Natalie Shublin, was presented to a grand jury, who agreed there was enough evidence to charge, and the now 76-year-old Arthur Massey was charged with murder on March 22, 2022. Massey has pled not guilty, and his trial will go forward. At this point, law enforcement believes that Massey broke into the home, and either Natalie returned while he was in the home, or he hadn't been expecting Natalie at the time that he broke in for a robbery. It is unknown why he targeted the Shublin family, and it is unclear if Mr. Shublin's job at the bank had been the motive for the robbery.
She had been bound at the ankles, she was face down, she had been stabbed in both the left and right side of her chest, and the back of her head had suffered a terrible blow.
Prosecutors say police who responded to the scene realized Shublin's vehicle was missing from the home, and they found it less than half a mile away where they'd find a key clue.
It appeared that that vehicle had been wiped down for fingerprints. Police who responded to the scene were still able to recover latent prints from that vehicle. But for several decades, they were unable to match those prints.
Decades later, new FBI technology identified Massey as the source of a fingerprint found on Shublin's stolen car, according to prosecutors, who say when interviewed by investigators, Massey at one point blamed his cousin for the murder.
He claimed in his interview in 2005 that he had subsequently learned from his cousin that his cousin had in fact carried out the murder and gave police close detail of how this had allegedly come to pass.
In 2019, following my creation of the cold case unit in this office, we again focused on this case. Throughout 2020 and 2021, Massachusetts State Police troopers, as well as the Bedford detectives, carefully examined the case, gathered information about the defendant's past, and sought to identify additional witnesses. During the course of this wide-ranging investigation, the police were able to identify a woman who admitted that she had been involved with Massey in schemes to defraud banks during the 1990s. She told the police that Mr. Massey habitually carried a knife and that he had bragged to her that he had previously killed someone with a knife. That information, along with other facts developed during the investigation, was presented to the Middlesex grand jury, which returned that indictment for murder today. This situation, being able to go to a family over 50 years later and tell them that we have taken the first step in holding someone accountable, that we have kept our promise that we will never give up, is exactly what we envisioned when I created the cold case unit in 2019. Putting our resources into a case, meticulously examining every detail and seeing what else can be done. In this case, our investigators poured through old records, developed information, and this indictment today is truly the culmination of years of investigative work. I am truly grateful, as is the family, and they've asked me to express that gratitude to all of the law enforcement partners who worked tirelessly to ensure that we would get to this day. I'm going to turn it over to Chief Fong, then I'll be happy to take some questions, but I would note that in speaking to Mrs. Shublin's son and daughter, they have asked, obviously this comes as news that is both welcome and a great surprise, and they have asked that their privacy be respected.
Today we're discussing 3 more solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 1. Lori Houts. On September 5, 1992, in Mountain View, California, a person jogging noticed something odd. It was evening, and the surrounding buildings were mostly owned by tech giants. The parking lot in the 1300 block of Crittendale Lane, which is now owned by Google, was mostly empty. Though it wasn't unusual to see cars still parked in the lot this late, someone appeared to be sleeping in one of them. The jogger approached and made the shocking realization that the person wasn't sleeping. Law enforcement arrived on the scene and quickly identified the person in the car as 25-year-old Lori Houts, and they quickly deemed her death as a homicide as she still had a nylon rope around her neck. Detectives determined that she had died in the car, as there were signs of a struggle. Her purse was recovered nearby, thrown over a fence near the crime scene. What stood out to detectives was that it appeared that the killer had been in the passenger seat, where they might have expected the killer to have been in the back seat. This led to detectives to believe that whoever killed Lori had been someone she knew or was comfortable letting into her car. Numerous fingerprints were recovered from in and around the vehicle. Lori worked nearby and had been expected to attend a wedding later that evening. With the help of her boyfriend, they'd been able to piece together her day. Lori worked for Adobe and worked less than 2 miles from where she was found. She planned to pop into the office. It had been a Saturday, and she hadn't planned on staying long after going home, getting dressed up, and meeting her boyfriend Brent at the wedding. Lori was a computer engineer, and she had landed the job at Adobe and was one of the few women working at the tech giant. She had been known to be an extremely hard worker, often going to work on the weekend and working late. She was incredibly talented and was a rising star in her field. This was right before the tech boom in Silicon Valley. Because she and her boyfriend were going to meet at the wedding, her absence wasn't initially a cause for concern. At first, he had just assumed that she'd gotten wrapped up with something at work, and Brent hoped she would turn up later, but she never did. Detectives were able to rule Brent out as a suspect, as he'd been miles away at the wedding where many people witnessed him. During his interview, he did allude to someone who may have been angry enough with Lori to kill her. He alleged that his roommate John Woodward had been increasingly aggressive towards Lori. They'd been dating for 5 weeks, and when he told his roommate that he had a serious girlfriend, he said that John started acting jealous. Brent was set up with a recording device and was asked by law enforcement to call John and get him to confess to murdering Lori. During that conversation, John didn't act surprised he was being investigated. There hadn't been a moment where he questioned why cops were looking at him. John didn't explicitly say that he killed Lori, but he did ask Brent what and how much evidence did the police have against him. Not exactly something an innocent person would say, but it wasn't enough. John was picked up for an interview and his prints were taken. He didn't have an alibi for that day. He claimed he was home alone and no one was able to corroborate that. While investigating Lori's car, they found over 80 fingerprints. Prints were found on the roof of the passenger side of the vehicle, as well as the handle and the inside of the door. The prints were a match for John Woodward. He was first arrested later that year and was charged with Lori's murder. His trial was in 1995, which resulted in a hung jury. There wasn't enough evidence. In the second trial in 1996, the judge didn't allow the prosecution to bring forward the prints found inside the vehicle or any discussions that John had killed Lori out of jealousy, as there wasn't solid enough evidence to prove that. The second jury also came back with a hung verdict, and the case was ultimately dismissed. After that, Woodward moved to the Netherlands, where he was the CEO of ReadyTech. Though the company remained based in California, its CEO headed their Amsterdam offices. After the second trial, the case ultimately went cold. No other suspects were discovered. There hadn't been any other evidence found that pointed to anyone else being in that vehicle. In 2020, the case was reopened with several pieces of evidence sent out for further examination. This time, they were looking for DNA. In 2021, they had the results that tied John Woodward directly to Lori's murder. DNA matching Woodward's was found on the rope that had strangled her. Woodward was still living in Amsterdam, and the U.S. Department of Justice worked collaboratively with the Dutch government. Dutch authorities arrested Woodward and executed a search warrant for his home and office. On July 9, 2022, John Woodward was extradited back to the U.S., where he was arrested at the airport in New York. Woodward, now 58, is being held without bail while he waits extradition back to California, where his trial will be held. Lori's sister, in a brief statement to the media, extended her thanks to law enforcement for continuing to pursue her sister's murder and for ensuring there was justice. She said of her sister, "Lori was someone we all aspired our daughters to be like, kind, loyal, and fun. The way Lori lived and treated people was a stunning example of what was right in the world. She was a gem to many, but her bright life was taken from us at the age of 25. This case is the culmination of incredible determination by our detectives over the decades and with phenomenal teamwork with our agency partners here in Santa Clara County and in New York," said Mountain View Police Chief in a press release issued by the department.
John Woodward was arrested back in 1992 and tried twice for the murder of Lori Houts. Now police say they believe they have evidence to put him behind bars.
She didn't get to meet my kids. I probably would have nieces and nephews now from her.
Lori Houts was 25 years old when she was strangled to death after leaving work on September 5, 1992. Mountain View police say 58-year-old John Woodward was arrested Saturday at New York's JFK Airport for Houts' murder.
You know, it doesn't really matter what happens because Lori is not coming back. We don't get to win and get our sister back. We get to win and maybe get some justice or some closure.
Family and friends gathered Monday after hearing of the arrest. Houts' best friend Marilyn, who met Lori in junior high school and went to college with her, has maintained a close relationship with her family.
I was very proud of her, and she stood her own, whether it was in the classroom or us playing co-ed softball, co-ed basketball in college. We missed that.
Woodward was last tried for Houts' murder in the mid-90s, and for the second time, he was not convicted. Police believe he killed her because of jealousy.
The motive, as much as we understand, is a love triangle, essentially, of the suspect lived with the male roommate, we believe was romantically interested in the male roommate, and he was dating the victim at the time.
Number 2, Lucia Jackson.
Lake Wildwood is a place far from town. Quiet. Peaceful. eerie almost, when the mist settles on the water. It's the last place Lisa Jackson was seen splashing around with her 2 older brothers on September 7th, 1979. They walked home. Lisa said she'd follow. She never did.
As a parent, your child is missing. You can't find her. You have no idea where she's at or what's happened to her, what's going on with her. It makes you want to try to solve this.
It was on September 7th, 1979 in Conroe, Texas, when 12-year-old Lucia Jackson was swimming at a lake with her 2 older brothers. The kids had walked to Lake Wildwood and lived nearby. Eventually, Lucia's brothers were ready to go home, but she wanted to stay longer. Her brothers started walking home, and they eventually saw her trailing behind and didn't think much of it. When the boys got home, they expected Lucia to walk through the front door shortly after they did. She hadn't been that far behind them when they last saw her, but she never did. They went back outside and didn't see her. They walked the route back and couldn't find any sign of their sister. Law enforcement was contacted shortly after and conducted a thorough investigation of the area, but again, nothing was found. The following day, the boys went back out to look for their sister. They felt responsible for her disappearance. What had been a silly argument between siblings had turned into something awful. That was when Lucia's tortoiseshell glasses were found in an intersection between the lake and their house, and they knew for certain that something bad had happened. Her parents filed an official missing persons report after the glasses were found, and the investigation focused on the belief that Lucia had been abducted. 6 days later, oil field workers discovered a body in a heavily wooded area. They had gone in to check on a pipeline that cuts through Conroe. The body was confirmed to be that of Lucia Jackson. Her murder was ruled a homicide, with her cause of death being strangulation. She had been sexually assaulted, with her clothing recovered in the area. Tire tread marks were also preserved as evidence, but there was little other evidence for investigators to go on. It was noted that the day that she disappeared, Lucia had been wearing a gold butterfly necklace with a matching gold butterfly ring. The ring was never recovered, and detectives had hoped it had been taken by the killer and one day could be used as evidence. But that never panned out, and the ring remained lost. For 4 decades, the case sat cold. Hundreds of leads came in over the years, and each one was investigated but never led to any advances in the case. As the years went on, so did the hopes of ever solving the case. In 2021, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Homicide Unit decided to reinvestigate Lucia Jackson's case. They sent off several items of evidence for advanced DNA testing. After 40 years, they had new DNA evidence. July 2022, the DNA matched with someone within CODIS, the National FBI database. Gerald Dwight Casey. Records show that Casey lived in Conroe at the time of Lucia's murder. It is unclear if there were additional victims connected to Casey. Casey had an extensive criminal history which included violent robberies, assault, and drug-related offenses. He had been in and out of prison frequently between 1976 and 1989. He was arrested in 1989 for robbery and murder. In 1991, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Casey's sentence was carried out in 2002. Lucia's cold case has now been closed, making it the MCSO's oldest cold case to be solved. In a statement to the media, they said, "The tenacity and diligence in solving this case by a dedicated team is a reminder to our public and to those who commit crimes in our communities that we will never cease our efforts to solve the hardest of cases and bring closure to traumatized families." Number 3, William Hamilton. This next, now solved cold case highlights how instrumental it is to keep these cold cases in the media. You truly never know who will see the coverage that may be instrumental in providing a piece of key information that will solve a case. On February 26, 1999, in a wooded area behind an old church cemetery in DeKalb County, Georgia, the body of a small child was discovered. The body had badly decomposed over the winter and was estimated to have been there for 3 to 4 months. The child was a boy, African American, around 4 feet tall, with a small frame, and his age was estimated between 5 and 7. He had been wearing a plaid and navy blue hoodie, red denim jeans, and Timberland boots. Law enforcement in the area worked hard to try and identify the child, but no one came forward. There also weren't any missing persons reports matching his description. An autopsy was done which showed he had high levels of diphenhydramine and acetaminophen from over-the-counter pain relievers and Benadryl in his system. Additionally, he had a significant head wound on his skull. Either the drug overdose or the injury could have been the cause of his death. When they couldn't identify him locally, they opted to do advanced testing on his teeth to see if there were any markers that would indicate he had been born and raised somewhere else. That examination came back to determine he was likely from the southeastern U.S., either Georgia or the Florida area. Medical examiners on his case started to call him Dennis to give the little boy something to be called other than the Clifton John Doe. It had been a case that spoke to many, with media across the U.S. featuring his case. Without identification, the case eventually went cold, but detectives were determined to find who this boy was and what happened to him. Several different reconstructions were done over the years, from a model figure to several reconstruction images. Annually, they would hold memorial events to keep his story in the media. It was one of these events in May 2020 that caught the eye of one woman. The woman had been looking for answers regarding a little boy she used to babysit who had disappeared decades earlier. 7-year-old William Deshaun Hamilton. She called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's tip line with a possible identification for the unidentified child. This tip was the first major lead in the case in over 20 years. An investigation began to find William Hamilton, who had lived in Charlotte, North Carolina in the late 90s. They traced his school records there, and when they investigated further, they learned that William's mother had abruptly pulled him out of the school year in December '98 and told people she was moving to Atlanta. It was only months after that when the body of the little boy was discovered. There were no records of William Hamilton after he was pulled from school. No medical records, school registrations, activity on a social insurance number. He simply vanished. This led investigators to believe that Ava had been correct in her identification. The next step was to locate his mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black, who had been the last person to have been with William, but tracking her down hadn't been easy. She had left Atlanta in late '98 and returned back to Charlotte, Georgia. It was then that William's absence was noticed, especially to Ava. Teresa gave conflicting accounts to anyone who asked about where William was, and she eventually left Georgia, disappearing for nearly a decade. She resurfaced in Alaska in 2010, then moved to Phoenix, Arizona, which was where she was located by law enforcement. She was arrested in June 2022 and required to submit DNA to compare to the remains of the little boy, and after 23 years, they could finally officially identify Little John Doe as William Hamilton. Teresa Bailey Black, now 45 years old, was arrested and will be extradited back to Georgia, where she will be charged with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of child cruelty, aggravated assault, and concealment of death. So far, it has not been released if she has cooperated with law enforcement or has provided details of what happened to William in '98. It has been reported that Bailey Black is not in good health. Her booking photos show she has a medical tube in. She also arrived in court in a wheelchair. She had also previously served prison in '94 for manslaughter and had a criminal history with several other nonviolent offenses.
For Ava, her long search for William is finally over.
This was God's plan, maybe give him a love and attention that he needed, and to be the one to pick up these pieces for him after she scattered them and thought they couldn't be put together. Maybe that was my purpose of coming into his life. to make sure that once his life was taken, that I would get him justice, and I have.
Today we're discussing a serial killer from Wales that has recently been identified, solving the cold case murders from the killer previously known as the Saturday Night Strangler. Let's get into it. It was September of 1973 in Neath, Wales, a quaint community 8 miles outside of the city of Swansea, when the bodies of two 16-year-old girls, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, were found in the early morning hours, dumped in a wooded area near their homes. The girls had been hitchhiking from a nightclub in the city of Swansea around 1:30 a.m. on September 1st, but the girls never made it home that night. The girls had been picked up, and despite what should have been a short drive home, the girls were driven to a grove of trees near where they lived. There, Geraldine and Pauline were both sexually assaulted, then apparently allowed to redress as indicated by dirt and debris on the soles of their feet and inside their tights. They were both killed within yards of each other, sustaining head wounds and strangulation marks. It was determined that strangulation by rope was the cause of their deaths. How their killer managed to control and murder both girls simultaneously is unknown and likely never will be. The homicides left two families grief-stricken and the local community afraid and outraged. To make matters worse, this was not the only recent murder of a local teenage girl. Just a few months earlier, in July of 1973, 16-year-old Sandra Newton had been found dead in Neath, her body dumped in a culvert near the mountain roadway. Like Geraldine and Pauline, Sandra had been hitchhiking home from a nearby nightclub when she was picked up, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death with the hem of her chiffon skirt. Since all of the girls had been hitchhiking when they were picked up and killed, it's easy to look at a case like this from a modern perspective and wonder why such young girls would have been getting in a car with a strange man alone at night. But in the 1970s, hitchhiking was normal. It was part of the culture, even for young women. There also often wasn't another option. When the girls were going out, there weren't any buses running at 1 or 2 a.m., and none of the victims had cars of their own. Taxis also would have been much too expensive, so this really only left hitchhiking when going out miles from home. With the hitchhiking, the assaults, and the strangulation in common, the connection between the murders seemed obvious to local citizens, news outlets, and police at first, but became complicated by the fact that Sandra had a married boyfriend who she'd been out with the night of her murder, who seemed a likely suspect in her murder investigation. Her boyfriend claimed they'd walked home in opposite directions, and that was the last he saw of her on the night of her death. Suspicion was cast on him, but he didn't have a car or license, and since her body was found miles away from where they had last been together, he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. So an alleged connection between the murders was established once again. Following the murders of Geraldine and Pauline in September, the Welsh police quickly assembled a huge team to catch the man that local papers began to call the Saturday Night Strangler. Over 150 detectives were dispatched to go door to door to see if anyone saw anything suspicious on the night of the murders. This case was about to become the largest murder inquiry in Welsh history. In 1973, when the investigation was just beginning, the term serial killer had not yet been coined. Little was known about this type of repeat killer. The personality or motivations of serial killers were not understood, and criminal profiling and psychology were fairly new concepts. It would take another 10 years before DNA evidence would first be used in a criminal trial. Therefore, the police understandably had little to go on, with the exception of one lead, a white car. Passing drivers had reported seeing this vehicle parked near Pauline and Geraldine's murder site between 1:45 to 2:15 a.m. on September 16th. Similarly, others had reported a similar same color, make, and model of the car going like the clappers, or very fast, in Neath at the time of Sandra's murder. They narrowed down the make and model based on witness statements to likely be a white Austin 1100, which at the time was an incredibly common vehicle. It had been Britain's best-selling car for almost a decade, with over 1 million vehicles sold in the UK. The police felt confident that their killer would own, or at least have been using that car, so they went right down the list of registrations, questioning anyone in the area who owned a white Austin 1100 car. The result was thousands of names that led to hundreds of interviews and an overwhelming amount of suspects and information. Police simply checked each Austin 1100 owner for an alibi and crossed each name off a list. There were so many people to comb through that the killer could have easily avoided suspicion and slipped through the cracks. And slip through he did. After several years without new information, the case went cold. It would be nearly 3 decades before new information gave the case any real traction and warranted its reopening. In the meantime, the families and communities were left without answers. In 2001, forensic science had really advanced to a point that the girl's clothing could be tested for DNA evidence. The girl's clothing was removed from an evidence box that had spent decades in sterile storage. Full DNA profiles were able to be pulled from the clothing articles that had been worn by Pauline and Sandra. Samples from the 2 cases could be tested against one another, hopefully proving that the murders were committed by the same person. DNA taken from the 2 separate crime scenes were exact matches, finally showing that these 3 deaths had been the work of a single serial killer. This new evidence was compelling enough to reopen the case. Detectives began scouring the national databases for a match using the new DNA evidence. While they weren't able to find an exact match, they did find a near match, which likely belonged to a relative of the killer. The similar DNA was that of Paul Capin, a local car thief, which led back to a man who had been questioned for owning a white Austin 1100 as part of the initial investigation in 1973. His name was Joseph Capin, and he was now suspect number 1. Joseph Capin was a local to the Neath area. He had been born in Port Talbot in 1941, going on to live there his whole life. Those who knew Capin described him as a man of violent disposition. As early as the age of 12, Capin had come to the attention of the police. By the time the murders were committed, he had a record of more than 30 criminal offenses, including robbing gas meters, car theft, burglary, and assault. He was frequently in and out of prison, and he had never been able to hold down a job for long, but worked as a bus driver and a bouncer at local clubs on and off, giving Capin the unique opportunity to commit the murders. He could have followed the teens right from the club. Capin's ex-wife Christine is partially to blame for why he was overlooked. She provided his alibi on the nights of the murder. Joseph and Christine Capin had met when he was 20 and she was 17. They married quickly after Christine discovered she was pregnant with their first child. Their 18-year marriage got off to a rough start when Joseph Capin was sent to prison for 3 years for breaking into houses and robbing gas meters 10 days into their married life. But even when he got out of prison and became a father of 2, it was never a happy household. Money was always tight since Capin couldn't hold down a job, and they barely made ends meet with his short-lived gigs. Christine also admitted to thinking it was normal for men to hit their wives. In an interview, Christine said, "I thought all men were violent. He used to sexual assault me every 2 weeks. It was against my will. I never wanted it. Joe would say, 'Come on,' and then he would insist on his conjugal rights." In one incident, Capin terrified his son Paul when he was just a child. While they were walking a beach, they found a dog. Capin decided it was too old and proceeded to pick up a wire and strangle the dog in front of his son. This was also around the same time that the murders were being committed. When the police came knocking in 1973 to inquire about the murders, Christine had not put 2 and 2 together. She was young and naive and did not believe her husband was capable of murder. Furthermore, because Capin was always committing petty crimes, Christine had learned to agree with him if the police showed up at the house. So, like she often had, she alibied him for the night of the murders, and the police checked him off their list. 3 years went by before the DNA evidence had landed Kappen back on the police radar and made him their top suspect in 2002. Yet another obstacle stood in the way of the killer being brought to justice. Kappen had died of lung cancer at only 48 years old in 1990. Though Kappen could never be punished for ending the lives of the 3 young women, the police hoped they could still find a way to prove his guilt and bring a sense of finality and peace to the families of the victims. In 2003, police found a way to do just that when they received permission to exhume Kappen's body, extract a sample of his DNA, and test it against the samples found on the girls. When they did so, they received the answer they had been looking for and finally proved that Joseph Kappen was the man who sexually assaulted and killed Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes, and Pauline Floyd in July and September of 1973. Kappen was the first person to be identified after death as a serial killer through familial DNA profiling. The conclusion of this case was not only a milestone in DNA profiling, but it brought answers to the 3 families of the girls who had never thought they would live to see their daughter's killer identified. Geraldine Hughes' father said of he and his wife, "We have relived what Geraldine must have gone through every night for nearly 30 years. Now we know for certain who killed our daughter, and we can finally find some peace. We took flowers to Geraldine's grave and had a few quiet words with her, and we felt we had put her to rest properly." In addition to the murders in 1973, Kappen is also being investigated for the murder of Maureen Malky, who was aged 23 and was strangled and killed in 1976. There were also several sexual assaults in areas he lived in and worked in that are being investigated to see if there's a connection. Joseph Kappen had been Wales's first serial killer. Cold case detective Dr. Colin Dark said in a statement to media, "After all these years of questions, suppositions, and heartaches to the girls' families, we got our man at last." Today we're discussing 3 more cold cases recently solved with new evidence. Number 1. John Stagner. It was around 5 a.m. on August 10, 1992, when Donna Stagner went to wake up her 53-year-old husband, John Stagner. The Stagner family lived in Orange County, Florida. John was a maintenance worker for the county, and the family lived in a home on the Orange County maintenance property and served as live-in caretakers for the equipment that was housed there. John had been called out the previous evening to repair a power line that had come down in a storm. When Donna had gone to bed, John had only just come home, and he was watching TV in the living room. The couple slept in separate bedrooms in the summer because Donna preferred to sleep with the air conditioning on and John didn't. She entered the bedroom John slept in and tried to wake him the following morning. She hadn't turned on the lights yet and touched his arm, only to notice he was cold to the touch. She turned on the lights and made the horrific discovery that her husband had been violently attacked. He'd been severely beaten to death. Donna called 911 and law enforcement came out to the property. Detectives secured the scene. DNA evidence, while in its infancy in 1992, care was taken to find as much evidence as possible that may be useful, and it was preserved well. The murder weapon, a wood cane or walking stick, was found at the scene, and it was determined that someone had come into the home while the family slept and attacked John while he slept. There was no evidence in the home to suggest there had been any struggles or break-ins. That night, John had been sleeping with his bedroom window open. It was a single-story house, and law enforcement believed the attacker entered the home that way. The crime was unusual. The home hadn't been burglarized, it didn't appear that anything was missing, and John had been the sole victim. John was a hard-working man. He had worked for Orange County for many years and was well respected in his community. He was also very generous and treated those around him with kindness. His murder had not only been shocking, but senseless. Officers started canvassing everyone in John's life, friends, family, and co-workers, trying to find someone who may have harbored a grudge towards John. One name came up: Ronald or Ronnie Cates. Cates was in his 30s, and his family was close to the Stagner family. The Stagners had really helped out Cates and his family, who at one point had been homeless, and John provided them with housing, money, and meals. Some even said that John had been a father figure to Cates. Needless to say, the Stagner family had always been kind and generous to the family. Detectives learned from Donna that John and Ronnie had a little bit of a falling out. John had lent Ronnie a bunch of tools and asked for them to be returned, and John was having a hard time getting them back from Ronnie, which had him frustrated. Law enforcement went to Cates' house to interview him, and when they got there, his young daughter answered the door and seemed visibly shaken. She said that he wasn't home. They stayed near the home for a bit and noticed later a truck peel out of the driveway. They went back to the home, and his daughter admitted that her father had been home and she had been instructed to lie to them. They wrote down a detailed account of the interaction, which had been helpful in the present-day investigation. They did eventually catch up with Cates and brought him in for questioning, and he gave several variations of his whereabouts the night that John had been murdered. Along with him evading police and other accounts from those who interacted closely with Cates, they were immediately suspicious that he may have been involved in John's murder. The best tools law enforcement had for prosecution in '92 were blood evidence and fingerprints, but because Cates had been a frequent guest, the prosecution didn't think it would be enough to prove that Cates had been in the home that night. Eventually, no additional information was found that could be used as evidence against him, and the case went cold. Then, in 1995, Ronald Cates was committed during a mental health crisis. While in a hospital, Cates confessed to killing a man in '92, but also had confessed to killing several historical figures, and although it was noted, there wasn't much that could be done with that confession because he hadn't been in a mental state that could hold him accountable. Then, in 2020, Cates found himself in other criminal troubles and was put in jail. Once he was in jail, Cates' wife came forward with information that she had been too scared to come forward with before. She explained that Cates was a violent man and he had abused substances for much of their marriage. Now that she felt it was safe to do so, she wanted to get justice for the Stagner family. She said that in '92 she had been the sole breadwinner for the family. She said that at the time her husband hadn't been able to keep a job because he'd been addicted to drugs. She also confirmed that Cates had sold several of John Stagner's tools that had been lent to him in order to purchase drugs. She believed that Cates had murdered John after he had confronted him about bringing the tools back. The murder weapon had never been released to the media, but had been some sort of homemade walking stick. She confirmed that Cates used to always walk around with one. She also revealed that he hadn't been home that night, but returned in the early morning hours on the night John was murdered, with his clothing covered in blood. When they interviewed Cates' children, one of them had a vivid memory of her father asking her to hide a bunch of clothing underneath the house. Then, 2 days later, she was asked to grab the clothing again, and she watched him burn the clothing. In August 2022, Ronald Cates was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He's being held in North Carolina jail while he awaits extradition back to Florida. Cates has been open and forthcoming with law enforcement. While he didn't explain the motive behind killing John, he did reveal how John was murdered and several details that only someone who had been there would have known.
On August 10th in 1992, our deputies responded to North Forsyth Road, where they found 53-year-old John Stagner deceased. He had head and facial trauma. So at the time, our detectives did suspect a friend of his named Ronald Cates. He would frequently borrow money and tools from Mr. Stagner, but we didn't have enough probable cause at that time to make an arrest. So we created the cold case team in 2020, and detectives started looking at this case again. So today, actually 30 years to the day, Ronald Cates is in jail in North Carolina, and we have charged him with this homicide, and he's being charged with first-degree homicide. So these cases are extremely important to us. We want our community to know that just because the case is a year old or 5 years old or 30 years old doesn't mean we stop investigating the case. And so we know that and we remember that every homicide victim leaves behind family and loved ones and friends, and that has an absence in their life because of these tragic crimes. So I'm so very proud of our cold case team. Since we started the cold case team in 2020, they have solved 13 cases dating way back to 1984.
The Orange County Sheriff's Office thanked the Cates family for coming forward with the information that led to Ronald Cates' arrest. While it is uncommon, they are grateful that they did that. Without their testimony, the case may have never been closed.
As far as what we've seen, that the Cates family went above and beyond to be able to assist us, give us a great deal of background for even the Stagner family as well as their father or their husband. So.
Number 2, Nancy Benelak. On October 26, 1970 in Sacramento, California, 28-year-old Nancy Benelak was late for work. It had been extremely unusual for her. She worked for the Sacramento County as a court reporter, and she never missed a court date. A coworker called her house and there wasn't an answer, so she called her son to ask him to swing by her apartment and check on her. He did, buzzing several times with no response. He then convinced the apartment manager to get access into the apartment, and after knocking several times without a response, they did. Inside, they discovered a brutal scene. There was blood everywhere. Nancy was found deceased in the home. Her autopsy determined she had been stabbed over 30 times. There was a massive investigation into Nancy's murder. Her fiancé at the time was Chief Public Defender Ferris Salami, and initially, they weren't sure if it had been retaliation from a disgruntled client. The killer had appeared to have taken care not to leave evidence behind. They found a piece of tape that appeared to have been used by the killer to wrap his fingertips in an attempt to not leave any prints. However, the killer may have underestimated Nancy, as there appeared to have been a massive struggle. Nancy had several defensive wounds, and it appeared that at one point she had managed to get the knife from her attacker and fight back because there was a significant amount of blood left behind from her killer. Salami had been with Nancy the night before. The two had gone for dinner, and he had dropped her off, stayed at her apartment for a bit before leaving around 11:30 at night to go back to his own apartment. He said it had been normal for Nancy to leave her balcony door open a bit so that her cat could go in and out of the apartment. She had never had any concerns about doing that since she lived on the second floor. Law enforcement believed that this is how the killer got in, by scaling the balcony below. The blood trail from the killer led from the balcony all the way to the apartment's parking lot. In the 70s, all law enforcement could do with blood was get the killer's blood type, which had been useful in eliminating suspects like Nancy's fiancé, but didn't lead to any suspects. They had interviewed over 500 potential suspects, but nothing brought the case to a close. Years later, the DNA profile was done and uploaded into state and national databases. For 5 decades, the case sat cold. Ferris Salami died in 2014 of leukemia at the age of 84, never knowing what happened to his fiancée. In 2019, the case was reopened by the Sacramento County Cold Case Team, and they decided genetic genealogy was going to be the best way to get an identification of Nancy's killer. Through that process, they identified several relatives related to the suspect, and in 2022, they finally had a confirmed identification after 52 years. Richard John Davis. He was a longtime Sacramento resident. He would have been 27 years old at the time of Nancy's murder, and he lived in the apartment building near Nancy Benelak. His apartment faced hers, and he would have had an unobstructed view into her apartment, and it is believed that he may have been stalking her. Davis didn't have any violent criminal history, but did have several DUIs. Davis died in '97 at the age of 54 from complications of alcoholism. Nancy's sister attended the press conference announcing Davis as the murderer. Retired Sacramento County Detective Mickey Lynx led the press conference.
You know, that's the whole thing of this, is not forgetting these cases. I mean, we have so many.
With Davis's death, there's no further path for justice. But for the victim's sister and family, they're finally receiving the answers they've been searching for all along.
We have missed sharing our children and grandchildren and so much more.
Number 3, Anna Kane. On October 23, 1988, the body of a young woman was found in a wooded area near Reading, Pennsylvania. Her death was immediately ruled a homicide. They determined she died by strangulation, and she still had balling twine wrapped around her neck. Law enforcement concluded that the woman had been murdered in a secondary location before her body was dumped in the woods. They later were able to identify the woman as 26-year-old mother of 3, Anna Kane. The local newspaper ran a cover story about the murder, seeking information from anyone who had seen Anna the night she died, or if anyone knew who she was with that night. Anna was a sex worker, and law enforcement were having a difficult time getting people to talk to police. Detectives didn't have a lot of evidence to go on, but they did discover that her killer had left DNA on her clothing, as well as the twine used to strangle her. Then, in 1990, a letter came into the newspaper that ran that story of Anna's death. Addressed from a concerned citizen, the writer had included several details that had never been released to the media, information only the killer would have known. Detectives believed that the killer had penned the letter to taunt law enforcement. They kept the letter, and years later they were able to collect DNA from the envelope and match it to the DNA found on Anna's clothing. In 2002, the Pennsylvania State Police received a grant, which would give them funding to do genetic genealogy testing, and later that year they had a suspect, Scott Grimm. Once Grimm was identified, law enforcement looked to confirm the DNA connection. Grimm had died in 2018 at the age of 58. However, he'd been involved in a harassment case with an ex-business partner where he had mailed several menacing letters. They compared the DNA from those envelopes to the DNA in Anna's case, and it was a direct match. At this time, law enforcement are continuing to investigate how Grimm connected with Anna and if there are more victims out there.
So Anna Jean Kane, it's a picture of the victim there. An old crime scene photo from the day she was discovered. Up there, there's a red mark on where she was discovered. Down here is the Reading area. So Anna Kane was discovered on October 23rd, 1988. The investigation revealed that she had been killed and placed at that location. She was from the Reading area, had recently moved to the Birdsboro area. Autopsy showed that it was ruled as a homicide, caused strangulation. So, as part of the investigation, the victim's clothing was collected, later analyzed for DNA. We were able to determine that an unknown male DNA profile was on multiple items of the clothing. In 1990, the Reading Eagle had ran a front page story about the homicide, kind of asking for information, stuff like that. And then in February of 1990, the Reading Eagle received an anonymous letter signed from a concerned citizen that had numerous intimate details about the homicide. This led investigators to believe that whoever wrote the letter had committed the homicide. So we later tested the envelope that the letter was sent in, where you would lick and seal the envelope. That was able to determine that the same DNA profile from the envelope had matched the victim's clothing, again leading us to believe that whoever had mailed this letter was the murderer. So recently we did genetic genealogy, which was completed by Parabon Nanolabs, based out of Virginia. They were able to determine that a possible suspect of Scott Grimm. We were able to determine that Scott Grimm had died in 2018 of natural causes. However, we were able to obtain a direct sample of Scott Grimm's DNA. We also found that in 2002, Scott Grimm had been arrested by Exeter Township Police Department in Berks County it was a harassment case where he had also mailed other letters to his former business partner. So we were able to take the direct sample from Scott Grimm as well as these envelope letters, We had our Pennsylvania State Police lab do a direct comparison to the DNA from the letter in 1990, as well as the original evidence from the victim's clothing, all of which showed that the same contributor, being Scott Grimm, was on, his DNA profile was on all of those items. Nate. This is a photo of Scott Grimm. We're still looking into him. It's still somewhat of an active investigation as far as some of the details of where he lived, where he worked, who his friends were, stuff like that. But he was native to the Hamburg area, and again, he died in 2018.
Anna's daughter, Tamika Reyes, was 9 when her mother was taken away from her. Despite the struggles her mother faced, she wants her to be remembered as much more than what the media has portrayed her to be. Anna Kane was a loving mother. She was outgoing, fearless, and caring. She cherishes the memories she has of her mother and remembers her as a woman who made great sacrifices for her children and was loved by all those who knew her.
I didn't think I'd see this day, but I had hope. My emotions are all over the place, happy, sad, angry.
Tamika Reyes was 9 when her mother was killed.
I was lucky enough to at least know her and get a little bit of time with her, but my brothers don't remember her. She was a person. She was my mother. She was Lovick and Michael's mother. We loved her. We still do, and you know, she never got the opportunity to make a change.
In law enforcement, investigating homicides are one of the most difficult cases to work. Detectives spend countless hours trying to solve these crimes, and in many cases, leads are limited and information is scarce. Victims' families seek out information that many times law enforcement cannot provide, and when all leads are exhausted, these cases are called cold cases by the law enforcement community. However, with ever-growing advancements in science, specifically in the arena of DNA and genetic genealogy, we are given the opportunity to take a look at many of these cases. I am pleased to announce that the Garden Grove Police Department, with the assistance and partnership of the Orange County District Attorney's Office and the Orange County Sheriff's Department, have recently solved 2 cold case homicides.
Today, we're discussing 3 more solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 1, Karen Stitt. On September 2, 1982, 15-year-old Karen Stitt took the bus from Palo Alto, California to Sunnyvale to see her boyfriend. It was only a few days before the new school year was to start. Originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Karen was to start her full school year on the West Coast. Karen had already made a splash since arriving in California. She was a sweet girl with a magnetic aura that drew people in. She was friendly, had a big smile, and a carefree attitude that seemed to help her fit in quickly. When Karen arrived in Sunnyvale, she and her boyfriend spent much of the afternoon wandering around town. They played video games at 7-Eleven and just enjoyed the last few days of summer vacation. Around midnight, Karen was escorted to the bus stop by her boyfriend, but he didn't stay with her. He had to rush home as it was already quite late. Karen took this bus often and knew the schedule well. The number 22 bus back to Palo Alto would only be a few minutes, and she would get back to her dad's house in no time. But when the bus came to the stop at the corner of El Camino Real and South Wolf Road, no one was there, so the bus didn't stop, and Karen never made it home that night. The following morning, a delivery driver made the horrific discovery of a nude teen's body little over 100 yards from that bus stop. Later identified as Karen Stitt, she had been bound by her clothing, stabbed 60 times, and sexually assaulted. Officers canvassing the area looking for any potential witnesses, they got something they thought might have been useful. One man said that he saw an old-fashioned panel truck near where Karen's body was found. He said that he noticed it because the truck was sitting with the parking lights on for a significant amount of time before driving off. Officers felt that this vehicle was likely driven by the man who abducted Karen from the bus stop and may have been where she'd been murdered before being dumped. The truck was never identified, and although the case was heavily investigated, there were no leads that led to an arrest. Eventually, the case went cold, but every September, friends and family of Karen would do their best to keep her cold case in the media, always holding hope that there would one day be justice for Karen's murder. 40 years would pass before there were any answers. In 2020, a DNA sample was obtained from the physical evidence collected from the original crime scene. That sample was put into CODIS, but no matches were found. Then, in 2022, the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety opted to try to use genetic genealogy to look for new potential suspects. The genealogy research led to a family with 4 brothers from Hawaii. Once a family was identified, law enforcement reached out to various family members to narrow down which brother the DNA belonged to. And in August of 2022, they arrested 75-year-old Gary Jean Ramirez from Maui. They were able to confirm that the DNA was a direct match to the sample found in Karen Stitt's body back in 1982. Ramirez was extradited back to California, where he was charged with Karen's murder. He is being held without bail. Law enforcement is looking to track his whereabouts throughout the years and believes there may be more victims. They believe that due to the level of violence and anger involved in Karen's murder, they doubt she was the only victim. His DNA was input into CODIS and is being tested across unsolved cold case victims across the country. Ramirez's next court date is unknown, but if convicted, he faces life in prison without the chance of parole. Number 2, Jeannie Childs. It was on June 13, 1993 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when Betty Aikman glanced at the TV while working as a hospice care aide. The channel was on the local news, and it was detailing the grisly discovery of a woman murdered. Betty's blood ran cold when she recognized the building. It was where her 35-year-old daughter, Jeannie Childs, lived. She immediately felt a feeling no mother should ever have to feel, a deep dread that consumed her. She tried to contact her daughter, but no one picked up. She had been the one to contact the coroner, and later had to identify her daughter's body. Law enforcement described the crime scene as horrific. Jeannie had been stabbed over 65 times, and many of the injuries were caused post-mortem. Evidence collected at the scene was foreign fluid found on a comforter, as well as a bathroom towel, bloody footprints, and the killer had injured himself in the process and left blood evidence behind. The initial suspect list had been vast and had included Jeannie's boyfriend, but DNA evidence had eliminated him. Jeannie had been a sex worker and had often worked from her apartment, as she felt it was safer than meeting clients at unknown locations. Her neighbors had given several witness statements for different men they had seen Jeannie with, but detectives had a hard time locating those men. Jeannie's Rolodex included phone numbers for certain clients, but they quickly discovered that many of them had fake names attached to them. Jeannie's case eventually went cold, but her mother vowed never to stop seeking justice for her daughter's murder. In 2018, the case was reopened with the hope of using genetic genealogy to locate her killer. However, they had been delighted to discover that a lengthy genealogical investigation would be unnecessary because a person matching the DNA they were looking for had uploaded their DNA to a private DNA company and online genealogy website themselves. This would have likely have been a company like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. A great stroke of luck had given detectives the best lead they'd had in nearly 3 decades. The man, Jerry Westrom of Asante, Minnesota, was the new lead suspect in Jeannie Childs' murder. Westrom would have been in his mid-20s in 1993. Records showed he also resided in Minneapolis from 91 to 93. He didn't have a violent criminal history, just speeding tickets and multiple driving under the influence convictions. And in 2016, he'd been caught attempting to solicit a prostitute. He'd been a well-respected businessman who was married with 2 children who were now adults, and he volunteered with several junior sports organizations. Those who knew him had no idea he'd been capable of such violence. They decided to put surveillance on Westrom in 2019 and followed him to a hockey rink. There they watched as Westrom ordered a hot dog from the concession stand and later wiped his mouth with a napkin before discarding it. Officers had been able to collect the napkin, which they were later used to positively match Westrom's DNA to the foreign sample found in Childs' apartment in '93. They later picked him up and had this interrogation.
Jerry? Yes. Jerry, I'm Chris Karakostas, work from the Minneapolis Police Department. This is Chris Smokers, FBI. Probably wondering what all this is about, I assume, or do you have any idea? I have no idea. Well, let's see if we can clear it up. You know, a lot of times, Jerry, believe it or not, I've had a lot of cases down here, and people come down and they're able to say, hey, you know, this is a situation, whatever, okay?
Westrom denied living in Minneapolis, knowing Jeannie, having ever been to the apartment she was killed in, and offered no explanation as to why his DNA had been found all over the crime scene. He was arrested in February 2019, but was released on bail until further court proceedings. In August 2022, his trial began. The key evidence presented to the jury was the numerous places his DNA was found in the apartment, as well as a very distinct bare footprint that had been found next to the victim's body. Expert testimony detailed the footprints can't be as detailed as fingerprints. Each is unique to the person. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before declaring a unanimous guilty verdict. Westrom, now 56, was sentenced to life in prison for the 1993 murder of Jeannie Childs. Her mother and niece both read victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing.
I talked to Jeannie the weekend that she was murdered. She had called me on a Friday and said she had an abscessed tooth and what could she do? I wanted to go there and get her and bring her home. She said, don't worry, I'll be okay. And I told her to go to the clinic and get some medication for pain. I talked to her Saturday. She was still alone. And, excuse me. And I never thought for 1 second that was the last time I would ever talk with her and say goodbye. I've waited so many years to have this end, and it's put my life through so much hell. And I just really feel I'll never forget and love her the way I always did. And I feel bad for my family and other families that are going to have to go through all of the process now of suffering over this. Something that should have never happened.
On June 13th, 1993, my parents sat me down and had to tell me something that changed my life forever. It flipped my world right on its head.
Number 3. Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. On May 21, 1987, 23-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd was discovered deceased in her bedroom by her housemate just before midnight. She shared a home with several other people in Garden Grove, California. An autopsy later concluded that she'd been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Shannon had been described as athletic, she loved horses and riding, she was funny and had an adventurous spirit. Her older brother said of his sister's murder, she was tough. She wasn't scared of much. It's hard for me to fathom how anyone could take another person's life like it was nothing and just discard them. Shannon's murder was investigated, but in her case, there were no witnesses that came forward, which greatly hindered the investigation. No one saw Shannon with anyone else, nor had they seen anyone who wasn't supposed to be in the house around. Nothing appeared to have been stolen from the room, and there had been no signs of forced entry. Because of this, the case eventually went cold. In 2003, the case was reinvestigated, and DNA evidence that had been found on Shannon's body was submitted to CODIS, the federal database for DNA. When uploaded, it got a hit, but not to a suspect, but rather another cold case that had occurred 21 months after Shannon's murder. On February 19, 1989, in Orange County, California, The victim, 27-year-old Renee Cuevas. Her body had been found along Lambert Road near the El Toro Marine Base in the early morning hours. Her cause of death had also been strangulation, and she had also been sexually assaulted. Little information has been released by law enforcement about Renee's case. Despite connecting the two victims, it did little to point cold case detectives towards a suspect. Neither of the women seemed to know each other, and there wasn't a link connecting the two that would help them find who had killed them. In 2021, the Orange County Investigative Genetic Genealogy Team decided to look further into the DNA and opted to try and locate him via genetic genealogy. They discovered a possible suspect, a man from Las Vegas named Reuben Smith. Smith had been known to live in the Orange County area in the 80s, and he'd be arrested in '98 for sexual assault and the attempted murder of a woman in Las Vegas. The woman detailed a horrific account of fighting off Smith with her life and eventually being able to get away from him and get to safety. The woman, who wishes to remain anonymous, said of the encounter, "It was horrible, the things that he did and the things that he said. He told me he was going to kill me. I knew if I didn't fight, I was going to die." Because of the '98 arrests, Smith had been required to submit DNA to the state, but for some reason, perhaps because there had never been a formal conviction, this DNA had never been uploaded to CODIS as it should have been. Instead, it sat in a Las Vegas evidence locker. Smith had been released while awaiting trial, and before there could be justice, Smith killed himself. In 2022, the DNA was formally matched to Reuben Smith, and it confirmed he had 2 victims and 1 attempted victim. Law enforcement agencies are working together to determine if there are any additional cases that link to Reuben, as well as cold cases in Michigan, where he is originally from. Detectives are asking anyone who knew Reuben Smith who can help narrow the locations he lived in. Well, that is it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this content and what I do over here, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you don't miss my next upload. As well, if you could give this video a like if you enjoyed the content, that would be much appreciated, as it is the easiest way to help the channel grow. We also have channel membership as well as Patreon if you want to get more behind the scenes content, as well as exclusive content, or just to support the channel. In the description box of this video, you will also find links to all my socials to connect with me, as well as other goodies. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you on the next one. Bye for now.